She threw away $5 million on a Tuesday morning, not in a bad investment, not in a failed company. She literally had them loaded onto a flatbed truck and sent to be crushed into scrap metal. 5 cars buried under tarps, each one a masterpiece the automotive world had been searching for decades. Evelyn Ashcroft was 30 years old, worth more than most countries, and she didn't even glance back as the truck pulled away. But one man did. And what happened next would shake the collector world to its core. If you've ever felt like you were sitting on something valuable that everyone else kept ignoring, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one doesn't go where you think it's going. The coffee in Nathan Carter's thermos had gone cold, somewhere between the third stoplight and the loading dock behind Kelsey Brothers Auto Parts. But he drank it anyway. Cold coffee was still coffee. He'd learned that the same way he'd learned most things in his 32 years. Slowly, the hard way, and usually without anyone around to point out there was an easier option. It was a Wednesday in early April, the kind of morning where the sky couldn't decide between overcast and threatening. The air smelled like wet asphalt and diesel exhaust, and Nathan had already been awake for 4 hours. Not by choice. His 7-year-old daughter, Maya, had woken up at 5 with a nightmare she couldn't fully describe. Something about a dog, and a parking lot, and her backpack being on fire. And by the time he'd talked her back to sleep and tucked her in properly, his own brain had refused to follow. So he'd given up, dressed quietly, and started his workday 2 hours before it was supposed to begin. He stood beside his van, a white 2008 Ford Transit with a cracked left mirror, faded magnetic signs on both sliding doors reading Carter Restorations, Classic Vehicle Specialists, and roughly 240,000 miles of honest labor on the odometer, and checked items off a clipboard while the guy from Kelsey Brothers, a heavy-set man named Doug, hauled boxes of brake hardware down a metal ramp. "You doing the Triumph?" Doug asked, setting down a box with the careful gentleness of a man whose back had opinions. "Finishing the Triumph," Nathan said. "Started in November." "November?" Doug raised an eyebrow. "What year is it?" "Same one it was when I started. I do the work right, or I don't do it." Doug shrugged like this was a reasonable, if inconvenient, philosophy, and went back up the ramp for another box. Nathan loaded the brake hardware into the van, checked the packing slip twice. He'd been shorted twice in 6 months by this particular supplier and had learned to verify before driving away, and was reaching for his pen to sign when he heard it. Not a loud sound, not dramatic, just the low groan of a diesel engine working harder than it needed to on a flat road, the kind of sound a truck made when it was loaded with something heavy and awkward. Nathan looked up purely by reflex, the way you look towards a sound without deciding to. The flatbed rolled past the mouth of the alley at maybe 20 miles an hour. There were 5 shapes under olive green tarps, tied down with orange ratchet straps that had seen better years. The tarps were doing their job. You couldn't see anything specific about what was underneath them, just shapes. Suggestions of shapes, really. The way sculpture looks under a sheet before the unveiling, just mass and proportion without detail. Nathan saw one of them and stopped breathing for about 3 seconds. He couldn't have told you exactly why. He'd try to explain it later, multiple times, to multiple people, and he'd always run into the same wall. Language just didn't have the right tools for it. It was something in the proportion. The way the rear section of one particular tarp rose and then dropped at an angle that no current production vehicle produced, because no one built things that way anymore. Because the engineering philosophy that created that particular curve had existed for a narrow window of about 11 years in the middle of the 20th century, and Nathan Carter had spent the last 14 years of his life learning to read those shapes the way a linguist reads dead languages. His pen hit the loading dock floor. He didn't stop to pick it up. "Hey," Doug called from the top of the ramp. "You need to sign." "Sign it yourself," Nathan said, already moving. "Use my name." He climbed into the van, started the engine before the door was fully closed, and pulled out of the alley without checking the mirror, which was the kind of thing he'd normally never do. The flatbed was already most of the way down the block. He followed it for 23 minutes. Nathan kept a careful distance, 2 car lengths in light traffic, sometimes 3. And spent the whole time arguing with himself. The rational part of his brain, the part that managed budgets and school pickups, and the logistical nightmare of being a single father running a one-man restoration business, had a straightforward position. You don't know what's under those tarps. You saw a shape for 2 seconds from 60 feet away. You had cold coffee at 5 in the morning, and you're running on 4 hours of sleep, and confirmation bias is a documented psychological phenomenon that affects even experienced professionals. The other part of his brain, the part his late father, Raymond Carter, had spent 30 years of Saturday mornings cultivating, said something much simpler. That's a Porsche, not just any Porsche. The body line he'd seen, that specific arc, that particular meeting of the rear haunches and the engine lid, had a fingerprint as specific as a serial number to someone who knew what they were looking for. And Nathan had been looking for things like this his entire life. His father had dragged him to barn finds before Nathan could drive, had made him study photographs and chassis records and factory-build sheets until the shapes of rare automobiles were as familiar to him as the faces of people he loved. Raymond Carter had called it the gift of pattern. He'd said it like it was something you were born with, which Nathan had always thought was both true and unfair. The flatbed turned onto Industrial Boulevard, which was a name that told you exactly where things were going, and Nathan felt his mouth go dry. There was one significant destination at the end of Industrial Boulevard. He'd driven past it 100 times, never with particular attention, the way you don't pay attention to things you've decided don't involve you. It was called Meridian Metal Reclamation, and the official version of what they did was vehicle recycling and scrap processing. The unofficial version, understood by everyone in the trade, was that cars went there to die. Whatever entered the yard was weighed by the ton, stripped for any components that might fetch something on the secondary market, and then fed to the crusher, which was not a metaphor for anything. It was an actual hydraulic press the size of a building that turned automobiles into cubes of compressed steel approximately 3 feet by 3 feet by 4 feet. The flatbed slowed at the gate. Nathan parked on the street, engine running, and watched a guy in a reflective vest check something on a clipboard and wave the truck through. He sat there for 20 seconds, maybe 30. Then he pulled in behind it. The man at the gate was named Jerry Paulson, according to the laminated badge clipped to his vest, and he had the particular expression of someone who had worked a job involving a lot of heavy machinery for a long time and had accordingly stopped finding anything very surprising. "Help you?" Jerry said. "I want to talk to whoever's in charge of purchasing," Nathan said, "about those vehicles that just came in." Jerry looked at him, then at the van, then at the Carter Restoration sign on the door. "You a buyer?" "I'm interested in having a conversation." Jerry picked up a phone that was mounted to the gatehouse wall and said something into it that Nathan couldn't hear. Then he pressed a button and the gate swung inward. "Park over to the left. Wayne'll find you." Wayne turned out to be Wayne Dressel, the yard's acquisitions manager, a compact man in his late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a handshake like a piece of industrial equipment. "Restoration guy," Wayne said, looking at the van. "What can I do for you?" "The flatbed that just came in," Nathan said, "the 5 vehicles. I'd like to talk about purchasing them before processing." Wayne's expression didn't change. "You haven't seen them?" "I saw one of them through a tarp from 60 feet away while moving." "And you followed the truck?" "Yes." Wayne looked at him for a moment, then almost smiled. "What do you do?" "Classic European, mostly post-war, some pre-war when I can get it." "And you think you saw something?" "I think there's a possibility I saw something that shouldn't go in the press." They walked across the yard together, gravel crunching underfoot, past a row of crushed cubes that Nathan tried not to look at directly. The flatbed had pulled up alongside a prefab metal building, and the driver was already unhooking the ratchet straps with practiced efficiency, folding them back over the tarps in a way that said he didn't care particularly what happened next. "Who's the seller?" Nathan asked. "Ashcroft Industries," Wayne said. "One of their satellite properties in Westfield. New management came in, decided to clear space, sent us a list. We made an offer on the lot. Done." "Did anyone look at them before the offer?" Wayne stopped walking. "We go off description and photos. Sometimes we eyeball them in person. These were in a locked-out building on a private property. Their people sent photos. We made a number. They accepted." He paused. "You're suggesting the number was wrong?" I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking to see what's under the tarps. Wayne looked at him a moment longer, then nodded once and called to the driver. Leave the straps. The driver shrugged and climbed down from the flatbed. Wayne grabbed the corner of the first tarp and pulled. They were in worse condition than Nathan had expected, and he had expected bad. The first one was a 1963 Lancia Flaminia that someone had painted over at some point in the distant past with a spray can and what appeared to be no particular technique, a flat gray-green that had bubbled and cracked over decades until it resembled the surface of something geological. The windows were opaque with grime. One of the rear glass panes had a long crack running from corner to corner that had been at some point taped from the inside with what had since become a brown stripe of petrified adhesive residue. The tires were flat, obviously, all four of them, and the left rear had deteriorated to the point where the sidewall had separated from the rim. The floor under the driver's door showed the orange bloom of rust working its way up from underneath. Nathan crouched beside it, ran his hand along the rocker panel, tapped at 3 specific points. Solid, he said quietly. What? Wayne asked. The structure's solid under the surface. Whatever this looks like, the bones are good. He moved to the second one. A Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, not a roadster, a coupe, the one with the gull-wing doors, which he'd recognized as soon as the tarp came off because there was really nothing else in the world that looked like a 300 SL coupe when you knew what you were looking for. This one had been repainted at least twice in its life, and neither repainting had been done well. The current color was an indeterminate dark burgundy that might have been red at some point, applied over what had clearly been white, and the edgework around the door seals and trim pieces was the kind that made professional restorers feel something close to physical pain. Someone had replaced the headlight bezels with aftermarket units that didn't quite fit. Someone had taken off the original hood emblem, probably sometime in the 80s, and what remained was a circular shadow in the paint. But the body lines were true. No major impacts. The famous doors opened with a sound that told Nathan the hinges were still, improbably, beautifully, correct. He didn't say anything for a moment. Nathan, Wayne said, give me a minute. He went to the third vehicle, a Alfa Romeo Giulietta Sprint that had at some point spent what appeared to be several years parked under a tree, judging by the depth of the staining on the roof and hood. The original engine, he could tell it was original from the casting marks on the block, which he read the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, was still in place, which was not a given with these cars. A lot of them had been through engine swaps at some point in the 70s or 80s by people who thought that replacing the original drivetrain with something American and larger was an improvement. The fact that this one still had its factory power plant was, by itself, meaningful. He'd have to check the matching numbers later, but his instinct said they'd match. The fourth vehicle was a Citroën DS21, the legendary French sedan that automotive historians regularly described as one of the most technically revolutionary production cars ever built, and which looked like something a science fiction illustrator had designed in a fever dream. A long, low, almost aggressive shape that seemed to be leaning forward even when standing still. This one was missing its hood, which was sitting propped against the back of the flatbed, and the hydraulic system that made the DS a mechanical marvel was clearly not functional. The car was sitting at an odd angle, collapsed on its suspension like a dog with a broken leg. But the body was there. The shape was intact. The interior, when Nathan opened the door carefully, smelled like old leather and something floral, probably a long-dead air freshener. And the dashboard, that extraordinary curved sweep of French industrial design, was cracked but complete. He saved the fifth one for last. He already knew. Some part of him had known since the alley beside Kelsey Brothers, since the moment that particular silhouette had crossed the mouth of the alley at 20 miles per hour. But he'd refused to let himself believe it until he could see it with his own hands, because hope was a dangerous thing in this business, and he'd learned that young. He grabbed the corner of the fifth tarp and pulled it off himself. The silence that followed lasted about 8 seconds, which was enough time for Wayne to realize that something significant had just happened, even if he didn't yet know what. What was under the tarp was a Porsche, but not the kind of Porsche that word called to mind for most people. Not the kind you saw at car shows or in magazines or in the driveways of people who wanted to signal something specific about their income. This was a 550 Spider variant, or something derived from 1, but the details were wrong for a standard 550, wrong in specific ways that told a very specific story. The body was aluminum, hand-formed, clearly. The surface irregularities of hand-formed aluminum were something no machine replicated because machines were precise and human hands were not. And that distinction, paradoxically, was what made hand-formed aluminum bodywork identifiable and valuable. The car was small and low, almost absurdly so, with a long nose and a very short tail and an almost total absence of any surface that wasn't aerodynamically purposeful. There were markings. Faded, cracked, partially obscured by a primer overspray that someone had applied at some point in the car's history in what appeared to have been an attempt to obscure them. But Nathan had a flashlight on his keychain, and he crouched in the shadow under the car's nose and looked at those markings for a long time without saying anything. Then he stood up. His knees hurt from the crouch. He didn't notice. "Wayne," he said, "what did Ashcroft Industries sell you this lot for?" Wayne named a number. Nathan stared at him. "Total," Wayne confirmed, "for all 5. Nathan looked at the 5 cars, looked at Wayne, looked at the crusher, which was visible from where they stood, a massive hydraulic structure at the far end of the yard that was simply waiting, patient and industrial, the way tools waited. "I'll pay you double," Nathan said. "Right now. Check today. For all 5 as is. I take them off your hands immediately, and you make profit without processing costs." Wayne pushed his reading glasses down from his forehead to his nose and looked at Nathan over the rims of them. "You know what you have there?" "I have a very strong suspicion." "You won't tell me." "I'm not certain enough yet to tell anyone anything. If I'm wrong, I've paid double for 5 project cars that'll keep me busy for 2 years, and I'll sleep fine. If I'm right—" He stopped. "I'd like to write you that check before either of us says anything else." Wayne looked at the 5 cars, looked at Nathan, looked at the flatbed driver who was leaning against the cab eating a granola bar and paying no attention to any of this. "Double," Wayne said. "Double. Today. I'll call my bank right now." Wayne took off his reading glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, which was something people did when they needed a moment that didn't look like a moment. "All right," he said. "Let's go to the office." Nathan called his sister, Patrice, from the parking lot of the scrapyard while waiting for the wire transfer to process. "I need to borrow money," he said when she picked up. There was a pause. Patrice was 2 years older than him, worked in accounting, and had what Nathan had always privately described as an instinctive suspicion of sudden enthusiasm. "How much money?" she said. Not a question. A preliminary investigation. He told her the number. "Nathan, I know." Nathan, that's more than your truck." "It's more than my truck and my equipment combined, yes." "Tell me why." "I found something." "At a scrapyard." "Yes." "Nathan, you followed a truck to a scrapyard." "I did." "Have I told you about confirmation bias?" "You have, Patrice. I need you to trust me." She was quiet for a moment, and he could hear her thinking, could actually hear it in the quality of the silence, if that made any sense, which it probably didn't to anyone who didn't know Patrice. She was running through the list of times he had been wrong about something and the list of times he had been right, and he was fairly confident he knew which list was longer. "You're sure?" she finally said. "I'm sure about 4 of them. The 5th one?" He stopped, looked out through the windshield at the yard, at the 5 shapes waiting on the flatbed. "If the 5th one is what I think it is, Patrice, this is the most significant automotive recovery in decades." Another silence, longer this time. "You sound like Dad," she said, and there was something complicated in her voice. Not just sadness, though there was that, but something warmer underneath it, like recognition. Nathan didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel, hands that looked like his father's hands he'd always thought, not in shape particularly, but in the texture of them, the specific kind of damage that came from a life spent with tools and solvents and metal. "Yeah," he said, "I know." "Send me the transfer details," Patrice said. "And Nathan, you better be right." "If I'm not," he said, "you can tell me you told me so for the next 10 years. "I'll tell you for 20, she said, and hung up. Evelyn Ashcroft was in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of the Ashcroft Industries headquarters building when her assistant, Lena, knocked and opened the door simultaneously, which was the kind of efficiency that Evelyn had come to expect and occasionally found exhausting. "The Westfield disposal is confirmed," Lena said. "Meridian picked up this morning." "Good," Evelyn said, without looking up from the contract she was reviewing. "And the property itself?" "The facility management team is in next Tuesday for the walkthrough. Once they clear the building, we can list it." "Fine." She turned a page, made a notation in the margin. What was in there besides the cars? Mostly estate inventory, some furniture, a few crates of automotive parts. They were itemized and the useful ones went to auction last month. The cars themselves were the last of it. Evelyn nodded. "My grandfather's hobby," she said, and the word hobby had a specific texture to it, not contemptuous exactly, but dismissive in a way that came from distance rather than familiarity. He collected things. He didn't always know why. "Did you want the disposal receipts for your files?" "Give them to accounting." She turned another page. "Is there anything else?" There wasn't. Lena closed the door and Evelyn returned to the contract, which was for a licensing agreement that would, if signed, add a new line of performance components to the Ashcroft automotive catalog. It was a significant deal. It required her full attention, and she gave it that. She did not think about the 5 cars on the flatbed. She had not, in the 2 years since inheriting the Westfield facility from her grandfather's estate, thought about them very much at all. She had seen them once, a quick inspection of the outbuilding, tarps in place, conducted in November of the previous year during a general property audit, and had noted them on a disposal list that she had then handed to a property manager to handle. They had looked to her like clutter. Old things. Things that had been sitting in a dark building accumulating dust, and that belonged to a version of the company's history that she had neither the time nor the particular interest to excavate. She was 30 years old. She had inherited a company at 27, after her grandfather died and left everything, including things she hadn't expected, to her. She had spent the intervening 3 years making decisions at a pace that didn't allow for the luxury of curiosity about storage rooms. This was not, in retrospect, her finest quality, but she didn't know that yet. Maya Carter was 7 years old, missing one front tooth, and had strong opinions about several things, including but not limited to the correct way to make a grilled cheese sandwich, low heat, patience, never press it with a spatula, the relative merits of various dog breeds, hounds were underrated, everyone over-celebrated retrievers, and her father's tendency to get distracted by old cars at inconvenient moments. She was eating a bowl of cereal at the kitchen table when Nathan got home that afternoon, and she looked up at him with an expression that was, he sometimes thought, uncomfortably similar to the one his mother used to give him when he came home late. "You're late," Maya said. "I know. You were supposed to pick me up at 3:30. Mrs. Kowalski got you." "Mrs. Kowalski smells like cats." "Mrs. Kowalski has 2 cats, Maya. That's just—" He sat down across from her, still in his jacket, not having made it past the kitchen threshold yet. He was tired in a specific way he didn't have a word for. Not physically, though that was part of it, but the kind of tired that came from something significant happening and your brain spending 8 hours trying to catch up with it. "I found something today." Maya lowered her spoon. She was a perceptive child, which was sometimes inconvenient and always, Nathan thought, something worth being proud of. "What kind of something?" "Cars." She considered this. "How many?" 5. "Where?" "At Meridian, the scrap place off Industrial." Maya was quiet for a moment, working through this with the methodical quality she brought to things that interested her. "Were they going to crush them?" "They were." "But you stopped them." "I bought them, before they got to the press." She thought about this. "Were they good cars?" "I think," Nathan said carefully, "that one of them might be one of the most important cars I've ever seen in my life." His daughter looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked her spoon back up. "You better call Aunt Patrice," she said. "Already did." "What did she say?" "She said she hoped I was right." "Do you think you're right?" Nathan pulled off his jacket and folded it over the back of the chair. His hands were dirty. He'd spent an hour in the yard doing preliminary looks before the tow trucks arrived, and he'd need to wash them before he touched anything else, which was a rule he'd had for as long as he could remember. His father's rule, originally. "I think," he said, "that I might be very right." Maya nodded once with the gravity of a person who has just been told something worth processing and returned to her cereal. The tow trucks delivered all 5 cars to his workshop on Thursday morning, and Nathan closed the big rolling door behind them and stood in the middle of his own floor and looked at 5 tarped shapes in the modest light of a space that had been, until that morning, occupied by a 1968 Triumph TR25. Oh, that he'd moved to his driveway with a dolly and a collection of bad words. The workshop smelled like it always did, penetrating oil and rubber sealant and the clean chemical sharpness of the stripping compound he used on paint, with underneath all of it the older smell of the building itself, concrete and wood and decades of mechanical work. His father had worked in this building. Nathan had grown up in it on weekends, handing tools, asking questions, learning the particular satisfaction of taking something broken and making it whole. He didn't rush. Rushing was the mark of someone who was more interested in what they hoped to find than in what was actually there, and Nathan had disciplined himself out of that tendency through years of having it lead him wrong. He set up his portable work light, got his notebook, his camera, a good one, a Canon DSLR that he'd bought secondhand and maintained carefully, because documentation was not optional in this work. It was the work. He started with the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, because it was the most straightforwardly valuable of the 4 cars he was already confident about, and starting with the known quantity was good practice. It gave him a baseline for his own judgment. The VIN plate was in place, intact, the stampings clear. He photographed it from 4 angles. He found the factory build sheet tucked behind the passenger side kick panel. They almost never survived, but this one had, protected by the dry conditions of the outbuilding and what appeared to be the automotive equivalent of dumb luck. And it matched. Engine number matched the case stamping. Transmission numbers matched their records. The car had been built in Stuttgart in 1955 and delivered to a dealer in Geneva, and if the paper trail he held in his hands was accurate, it had spent the first 20 years of its life in Switzerland before crossing the Atlantic in 1976. He photographed everything, took 3 pages of notes, moved on. The Lancia, the Alfa Romeo, the Citroën, each one yielding its history in pieces, requiring patience and a flashlight and the ability to read the language of old metal, each one confirming what he'd suspected, each one a significant piece of automotive history that had come within one hydraulic press cycle of ceasing to exist. He took a break at 1 in the afternoon, called Maya's school to confirm she was in pickup today with the after-school program, ate a sandwich standing at his workbench, drank water, not coffee, because he needed his hands steady. Then he walked to the 5th car. He didn't pull the tarp immediately. He stood in front of it for a moment, which was something he'd never quite been able to explain to anyone. This specific ritual of pausing, of letting the moment be what it was before you changed it. His father had done it too, the same pause before revealing something, and Nathan had asked him once what he was doing. Remembering that it might not be what you think it is, his father had said, and deciding you're okay with that before you look. Nathan pulled the tarp. The Porsche sat in the workshop light, small and silver gray, the aluminum body catching the fluorescent glow in a way that was different from steel, a warmer, more diffuse reflection, almost as if the metal were holding the light rather than bouncing it. He started at the front and worked methodically toward the rear, photographing every panel, every seam, every rivet, every marking visible and hidden. He got under it on a rolling creeper and spent 45 minutes beneath the chassis, reading the stampings with a flashlight and a magnifying glass, comparing what he saw against the chassis records he'd been carrying in his memory since he was 15 years old and his father had made him memorize them. At the rear, behind the engine lid, in a location that very few people would ever think to look, he found the stamping he was looking for. Small. Factory applied. Partially obscured by the primer overspray, but not entirely. He photographed it. Photographed it again from a different angle, with the flashlight held differently. Got up from the creeper and stood in the middle of the workshop and looked at his camera screen for a long time. Then he called his father's oldest colleague in the industry, a man named Franz Bauer, 71 years old, now retired in Stuttgart, who had spent 42 years working as a Porsche motorsport historian and who had the direct personality of someone who had no patience left for anything that wasn't exactly what it claimed to be. The phone rang 4 times. 5. "Bauer," said a voice that sounded like gravel in a coffee can. "Franz, it's Nathan Carter." A pause. "Carter. Raymond's boy." "Yes." "What do you have?" Nathan looked at the camera screen, looked at the car. "I'm not ready to say what I have yet. I need to ask you something first. The RS 550 factory lightweights that went missing in 1971. The Sicilian cars," Franz said immediately, and his voice changed. A tightening, a sharpening, the way an old hound's body changes when it catches a scent it remembers. "Right. The 2 that were confirmed lost, the ones that never turned up after the collection sale." "Nathan," the old man's voice was very quiet. "Where are you calling from?" "My workshop, in Portland." "And what are you looking at while you call me?" Nathan looked at the car, silver gray, small and low and built for one purpose, and that purpose was speed. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "That's why I'm calling you." Franz Bauer was quiet for a very long time. "Send me the photographs," he said. "Everything, tonight. Don't let anyone else see them yet." "Agreed." "And Nathan." "Yeah." "If this is what you think it might be." The old man stopped, started again. "Your father would have lost his mind." Nathan sat down on the rolling creeper, right there in the middle of the workshop floor, because his knees had decided they needed a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He looked at the car for a long time after he hung up. The workshop was quiet. Outside he could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower and, somewhere further away, a dog barking at something that probably wasn't worth the energy. 5 cars. 1 week ago, they had been scheduled for the crusher. 1 week ago, Evelyn Ashcroft had approved a disposal list without looking at what was on it, because she was busy and it seemed like a simple decision. It had not been a simple decision. Nathan got up off the creeper, knees protesting, and went to get his camera so he could start uploading photographs to send to Stuttgart. He had a lot of work to do. Franz Bauer's email arrived at 2:47 in the morning, Portland time, which meant the old man had stayed up past midnight in Stuttgart to write it, and that alone told Nathan something. He'd been asleep for maybe 3 hours. The deep, dreamless kind that came from genuine exhaustion rather than peace, when his phone lit up on the nightstand. He'd set a specific alert for Franz's email address before going to bed, which was something he'd done without quite admitting to himself why. And now he lay there in the dark for a moment, staring at the ceiling before reaching for the phone. The subject line was 3 words: "Call me now." Nathan sat up, checked the time, looked at the wall of his bedroom, which was also the wall of the hallway that led to Maya's room, as if proximity to his daughter could somehow anchor him before he did whatever came next. Then he got up, put on the sweatpants that were crumpled on the chair by the closet, and went downstairs to the kitchen so the call wouldn't wake her. Franz picked up on the first ring. "The chassis number is real," the old man said, without preamble or greeting. "I've been on the telephone with 3 people in the last 2 hours. One of them is the foremost private authority on factory Porsche competition cars in the world, and one of them used to work in the Porsche archive in Zuffenhausen, and all 3 of them said the same thing when I read them the number." Nathan was standing at the kitchen sink. He turned on the cold water and cupped some in his hand and put it on the back of his neck, which was something he did when he needed to think clearly and didn't have the patience to wait for his brain to catch up naturally. "What did they say?" he asked, though part of him already understood the answer, had understood it since he'd crouched on the rolling creeper with a flashlight and seen that stamping in the aluminum. "They said it's the Vasari car," Franz said. The name sat in the air between them, crossing 7 time zones and an ocean to do it. Nathan had known the Vasari car the way he knew certain things his father had told him, not as an abstraction or a legend, but as a specific, documented physical object that had existed in the world, and then, for reasons that automotive historians had been arguing about for 50 years, stopped existing in any verifiable way. It had been a factory development car, built in 1957 as a one-off experimental variant of the 550 program, with modifications that the factory had made specifically for a Sicilian collector named Enzo Vasari, who had commissioned something unique and paid accordingly. When Vasari died in 1969, his estate had sold the collection, and the development car had allegedly been purchased by a German intermediary whose identity was disputed, and after that the trail went cold. Some people said it had been broken for parts. Some said it had burned in a garage fire somewhere in northern Italy. The most widely accepted theory, repeated in the kind of automotive histories that cost $400 and came in a slipcase, was that the car was gone. Nathan looked at the refrigerator, which had a crayon drawing of a horse on it that Maya had made in February and which he had put up with a magnet and not taken down. "Franz," he said, "how sure are we?" "The chassis number matches the factory records. The aluminum body construction matches the documentation. The specific modifications, the rear bodywork variations, the firewall configuration, are consistent with what the factory records describe." A pause. "We need a physical inspection by someone credible. We need the full provenance chain verified. We need at minimum 2 independent authentication processes. This cannot be one man's opinion." "I know." "Nathan, do you understand what you're telling me you found?" He understood. He understood that the Vasari car, if authenticated, was not simply a valuable automobile in the way that a 300 SL or a Giulietta Sprint was valuable. It was a missing artifact, a piece of automotive history that belonged in the same conversation as significant works that disappear from museums and reappear in farmhouses, or manuscripts that scholars had given up on finding, or instruments that turn up in pawn shops after a century of absence. Its value at auction was not something that existing market comparisons could reliably predict, because there were no existing market comparisons. There was nothing to compare it to. "I understand," Nathan said. "You cannot tell anyone else yet. Not until we have authentication. If this gets out before we have documentation, you'll have lawyers on your doorstep within 48 hours. "Evelyn Ashcroft," Nathan said. "Whoever threw it away," Franz said. "They will find out eventually. They always do. And when they do, you want your documentation to be airtight." Nathan thanked him and hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a while after that, the cold water still running in the sink, not quite ready to turn it off. Outside, the neighborhood was completely quiet. Portland at 3 in the morning had a specific quality of silence. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended, like the city had paused between versions of itself. He thought about his father. He thought about the Saturday mornings in this same building when Raymond Carter would pull the tarp off something and say, "Tell me what you see, son. Not what it is, not what it's worth. What you see." The discipline of looking before concluding, the refusal to let hope do the work that evidence was supposed to do. He turned off the water, dried his hands on a dish towel, and went back to bed. He didn't sleep again for a long time, but he lay still with his eyes closed and made himself breathe slowly, which was the closest available substitute. Today, technically, was going to be a complicated day. The first thing he did in the morning, after getting Maya up and making her breakfast and driving her to school, was call a man named David Reese. Reese was a restoration specialist and authentication consultant based in Boston, 54 years old, with a reputation in the industry for being expensive, slow, meticulous, and correct. He'd worked with Sotheby's and Bonhams and RM and a handful of private collections, and his written authentication reports had been used in legal proceedings on 3 continents. He was not Nathan's friend. They'd met at an auction in Chicago 4 years ago and maintained the kind of professional relationship characterized by mutual respect and very little warmth. But Nathan trusted his judgment in the way he trusted a good torque wrench, because it had been proven accurate over a long period of time. "I have something I need you to look at," Nathan said, "in person, as soon as you can get here." Reese was quiet for a moment. "Portland?" "Yes." "Nathan, I have 3 projects. I know. I wouldn't call you if it wasn't important. Everything people call me about is important to them." "This is important to the industry," Nathan said. "I'm not ready to say more than that on the phone. I need you to trust me enough to book a flight." Another silence. Reese was the kind of man who didn't fill silences out of discomfort, which Nathan had always respected about him. How long have you had it? 4 days. And you've been sitting on it for 4 days without telling anyone. I've been talking to Franz Bauer. A longer silence this time, and when Reese spoke again, his voice had shifted in a way that was barely perceptible, but that Nathan noticed. I can be there Saturday. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If this is nothing, you're paying my travel expenses. Fair enough, Nathan said. It was not nothing. David Reese arrived on Saturday afternoon with a rolling carry-on bag and a hard-sided case that contained his documentation kit, camera equipment, measuring tools, fiber optic inspection light, and a laptop loaded with factory records and historical documentation databases that he'd spent years compiling. He was a compact man with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and the particular manner of someone who had spent a long career being unimpressed by things people expected him to be impressed by. He walked into the workshop, took in the 5 cars arranged along the walls, and said nothing for about 30 seconds. The Mercedes first, Nathan said. I'll decide the order, Reese said. Nathan stepped back and let him work. That was the thing about bringing in someone like Reese. You handed it over completely, or you might as well not have called. Reese moved through the 4 cars methodically, spending between 40 minutes and 2 hours with each one, photographing, measuring, consulting his documentation, making notes in a small paper notebook with a mechanical pencil. He didn't offer commentary. He answered Nathan's occasional questions with monosyllables or requests for better lighting. It was the most patient Nathan had been in recent memory, which was saying something given that his general professional temperament was fairly patient to begin with. He made coffee. He organized his own documentation. He called Patrice to give her an update, which was mostly him saying, yes, I still think I'm right, and her saying you better be with declining levels of agitation. Reese took a break at 5 o'clock, coffee, black, no conversation, and then went to the 5th car. Nathan watched from a workbench across the workshop, his hands wrapped around his own coffee cup, and did not go near the car while Reese worked. He watched Reese run the same initial circuit he'd run himself, the same panel examination, the same chassis inspection with the rolling creeper, though Reese spent longer under the car than Nathan had, and came back up with a different expression. Not excited, but contained, the way a person looked when they were working hard to stay neutral about something they were not neutral about. The stamping took Reese about 20 minutes to reach. Nathan could tell when he found it by the fact that he went very still for a moment, and then slowly repositioned his flashlight, and then took approximately 11 photographs from different angles. Then he got off the creeper and stood up and looked at the car for a long time without speaking. David, Nathan finally said. Reese looked at him across the workshop. Where did you get this? Nathan told him the whole story, the truck in the alley, the scrapyard, Wayne Dressel, the number he'd paid. Reese listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Nathan finished, Reese was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You know what this is? I think I know what this is. The chassis number is consistent with the Vasari factory development car. The body construction matches documented specifications. The modifications to the rear section are specific to the factory records and are not something that could be replicated by someone who didn't have access to those records. He paused. I'm not in a position to give you a written authentication today. That requires additional provenance research, comparison with archived factory materials, and a consultation with at least one other qualified specialist. But Nathan, he stopped, looked at the car again. I've been doing this for 26 years. I've seen a lot of things that turned out not to be what people thought they were. He picked up his coffee cup. This is not that. Nathan let out a breath he wasn't aware he'd been holding. How long for the written authentication? 6 weeks minimum, possibly 10. It's not a process you rush. Agreed. And the others? Reese gestured at the 4 cars along the walls. Significant. The 300 SL is numbers matching with the original build sheet. The Lancia is cleaner than it looks. The body's solid, and I think the engine's original. The Alpha's got its factory drivetrain. The Citroen's in the worst condition, but it's a DS21 with full documentation. 4 significant cars and one that's potentially historic. Reese set down his coffee. The Ashcroft family is going to find out. Eventually. When they do, they're going to have lawyers arguing the sale was invalid. The sale was a legitimate transaction with a licensed scrap dealer, Nathan said. I have the paperwork. Meridian has the paperwork. The cars were voluntarily surrendered for destruction. That won't stop the lawyers. I know. Nathan looked at the Porsche. That's why I want the authentication locked down before anything becomes public. Reese nodded slowly. I'll start the process Monday morning. I'll need copies of everything you have. He looked around the workshop. The modest space, the good equipment, the organized chaos of a working restoration shop. You're going to restore them? All 5. That's the plan. That's a significant undertaking for one person. I know. You might consider bringing in additional help. I might, Nathan said, in a tone that meant he wasn't going to, and Reese, who had enough professional experience to recognize that particular tone, didn't push it. He left Sunday morning, carry-on and hard case, and the contained excitement he'd been working to suppress since Saturday evening. At the door of the workshop, he turned back and said, Don't let anyone in here who doesn't need to be here. Obviously, Nathan said. And Nathan. The older man looked at him with something that, from David Reese, passed for warmth. Your father would have... Yeah, Nathan said. I know. It was the second time in a week someone had said that to him, and it didn't get easier the second time. The days that followed had a specific quality that Nathan struggled to describe to anyone who asked, which was mostly Patrice and occasionally his friend Marcus Webb, who ran a machine shop 3 blocks from the workshop, and who knew enough about the automotive world to follow the broad outlines without understanding the specific significance. The quality was something like pressure, not stress exactly, but the sensation of containing something large in a small space, of knowing something that had weight to it and having to carry that weight quietly while the rest of the world proceeded with its regular business. He went to school pickups. He made dinner. He helped Maya with a project on weather systems that involved cutting clouds out of blue construction paper, which he did sitting at the kitchen table with a pair of children's scissors that barely fit his fingers while she supervised his technique with the focused authority of a 7-year-old who knew what she wanted. You're being weird, she told him on the 3rd evening. I'm cutting clouds. You're thinking about the cars. He looked up at her. She was gluing a cotton ball cumulus cloud to her poster board with the careful concentration of a surgeon. A little, he admitted. The important one? He'd told her in general terms what he thought he'd found. He'd explained it the way his father had explained things to him. Not dumbed down, not wrapped in unnecessary mystery, but straight. She was 7, not stupid, and she deserved straight. Still waiting to know for sure, he said. But you think so? I think so. She pressed her cotton cloud down firmly and smoothed the edges. Grandpa would be excited, she said. He would. He'd probably already have it apart. Nathan laughed. A real one, short and surprised. He would absolutely already have it apart. Probably would have had it half stripped the same night. Is that bad? It's not how I work, Nathan said. But it wouldn't have been bad for him. He picked up the scissors again. Your grandpa had a different relationship with patience than I do. What does that mean? It means he was worse at it. Maya considered this. Are you good at patience? Getting better, Nathan said. It takes practice. She nodded, accepting this as a reasonable answer, and returned to her cloud. The first real complication arrived 12 days after Reese's visit, in the form of a phone call from a number Nathan didn't recognize, with a Chicago area code. Mr. Carter, said the voice on the other end. Male, professional, the specific enunciation of someone who made a living talking. My name is Gregory Mast. I'm a legal representative for Ashcroft Industries. I was hoping we could have a conversation about some vehicles that were recently transferred from an Ashcroft property in Westfield. Nathan was standing at his workbench in the middle of sanding a section of the Lanch's door jamb, and he set down the sanding block very carefully before he answered. I'm happy to have that conversation, he said. My attorney's name is Sandra Kolich. I'll give you her number and you can arrange a call through her. A brief pause. Mr. Carter, we're not necessarily in an adversarial position here. I didn't say you were, but I'm not going to discuss the vehicles without my attorney present, because that's the reasonable thing to do when a company's legal representative calls me out of the blue. It's not personal. He picked up his pen and wrote Sandra's number on the corner of the paper bag his lunch had come in. Ready? Mast took the number. He was professionally cordial about it, which Nathan found slightly more unsettling than if he'd been aggressive. Cordial meant they'd thought about this in advance. Cordial meant someone with authority had decided that aggression wasn't the right opening move. He called Sandra before Mast had probably gotten off the elevator. Sandra Kolich had represented Nathan in 2 previous disputes. One, a contractual disagreement with a client over restoration scope. One, a minor insurance issue involving the transit. And she had the particular manner of someone who took small cases seriously and large ones with measured calm. She listened to the situation and asked 5 specific questions, and then said, "Send me everything. The original transaction documents, the scrapyard paperwork, the wire transfer records, everything, today if possible." "Already scanning," Nathan said. "Good. Don't talk to anyone from Ashcroft Industries without me. Don't let anyone into the workshop who doesn't have a reason to be there. And Nathan," she paused, "the authentication process you mentioned. How soon?" Reese said 6 to 10 weeks. We're at about 2. Speed it up if you can, not by cutting corners, by providing whatever Reese needs to move faster. Authenticated provenance is your protection here. I know. One more thing. How did they find out? Nathan had been thinking about that since the call. The scrapyard sale had been simple and private. Reese had said nothing. He'd stake his professional life on Reese's discretion. Franz Bauer had talked to 3 people, but all 3 were European historians with no connections to Ashcroft Industries that Nathan was aware of. "I don't know," he said. "Find out if you can," Sandra said. "It'll tell us something about how much they know." He found out 3 days later, indirectly, when Marcus Webb called him from the machine shop and said, "Hey, you know the Meridian yard?" "Yeah." "I just heard through Terry Blount, you know Terry, he does the tow work out of Meridian, that someone from a legal firm in Chicago was asking Wayne Dressel questions about a sale he made about 2 weeks ago." Nathan closed his eyes briefly. "Wayne talked to them?" "Terry said Wayne referred them to his own lawyer, which I guess is the right call, but the point is they found the trail." A pause. "You okay?" "Fine," Nathan said. "Thanks for the heads up." He called Sandra immediately and told her. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "All right, that's actually okay. It means they found the transaction, which is public record. It doesn't mean they know what they had, yet." "They will soon," Nathan said. "Yes, they will." Another pause. "How are the cars?" "Coming along," he said. They were. Despite everything else, the calls, the anxiety, the logistical challenge of managing legal exposure while simultaneously doing the actual physical work, the restoration was progressing. Nathan had a system, and the system required that the cars come first, because the cars were the thing that everything else depended on, and because the work of restoration was the only part of this entire situation that was purely his, that no lawyer or legal representative or anxious family member could touch or complicate. He'd started with the Lancia because the Lancia was the most structurally sound of the 4 primary vehicles, and starting with a win, even a partial one, was good for momentum. The flat gray-green paint was coming off in the kind of slow, careful strips that required both chemical stripper and patience, and what was underneath was better than he'd hoped. The original Flamma Blue, Lancia's distinctive shade from the early 60s, was still there under the spray bomb overcoat, faded and thin in places but present, the color of a late afternoon sky before it decides to go either gray or gold. He photographed it before stripping further. Evenings, after Maya was in bed, he'd sit at the workbench with his notebook and plan. He was doing the work of 3 people, which meant he had to be strategic about everything, sequencing the jobs so that the chemical processes could run while he was doing mechanical work on a different car, using the dead time of paint cure cycles to do research or documentation. He drank too much coffee and slept not quite enough, and forgot, on 2 separate occasions, to eat lunch, which Maya pointed out both times with the particular disapproval of someone who had been told by her teacher that lunch was the most important meal of the day and had taken this very seriously. "You're running yourself into the ground," Patrice told him on a phone call in the 3rd week. "I'm managing," he said. "Nathan, you're restoring 5 cars alone while dealing with corporate lawyers." "I'm not alone. I have Sandra. Sandra handles the legal part. I mean the physical work. Can't you bring someone in? He thought about it. There were people he trusted enough. Marcus, who wasn't a restoration specialist but could handle bodywork under supervision. A woman named Julie Tran, who'd apprenticed with him briefly 2 years ago before going to work for a shop in Seattle, who he could theoretically call. But bringing someone in meant telling them what the collection was, and telling people what the collection was still felt like opening a door he wasn't ready to open. Not yet, he said. You're stubborn. Also, he said, I learned it from somewhere. Patrice made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Don't blame me for your genetics. The authentication report from David Reese arrived in the 7th week, which was faster than the minimum he'd promised, and Nathan understood from that speed alone that Reese had prioritized it in a way he rarely prioritized anything. The report was 43 pages, including appendices and photographs, written in the precise, measured language of professional authentication, in which excitement was expressed through understatement and certainty was conveyed through the careful accumulation of documented evidence. The conclusion, on page 7, read, based on chassis number verification, body construction analysis, component examination, factory documentation comparison, and consultation with independent specialists in Stuttgart and Modena. It is the opinion of this examiner that the vehicle presents compelling and consistent evidence of being the factory development car known as the Vasari Spider, a one-off competition variant constructed in 1957 and lost to documented provenance since 1969. Further provenance research is recommended, but the physical evidence is unambiguous in supporting this identification. Nathan read that paragraph 3 times. Then he called Franz Bauer, who'd seen a copy simultaneously, and the old man said nothing for several seconds, and then said, in German, something that Nathan's German wasn't good enough to fully translate, but which he understood by the tone to be the automotive equivalent of a prayer. Then he called Sandra. Authentication's complete, he said. 43 pages. Conclusion is unambiguous. Good, she said. He could hear her writing something. Now the work gets harder. The restoration's been hard, he said. The restoration, Sandra said, is the easy part. He thought about that after he hung up, standing in the workshop in the morning light, surrounded by 4 cars in various stages of becoming what they'd been before time, and neglect had worked on them. The Lancia was in primer, smooth and clean, waiting for its original color. The Mercedes was fully stripped and awaiting bodywork on the lower driver's door, where someone had taken a small impact sometime in the past 40 years and done a repair with the wrong filler compound. The Alfa's engine was on a stand, fully disassembled and cleaned, each component labeled and stored, waiting to be rebuilt. The Citroën was partially reassembled on its hydraulics, which Nathan had rebuilt from scratch with new seals and fluid. And the Porsche sat at the far end of the workshop under a clean white cotton cover, authenticated, documented, and waiting. He hadn't started the restoration on it yet. He was building up to it the way you built up to the most difficult conversation you knew you had to have, not avoiding it, but gathering himself. He pulled the cover off and looked at it in the morning light, small, silver gray, built for one thing. All right, he said to it quietly in the empty workshop. He went to his toolbox and started choosing what he'd need. The Porsche didn't give itself up easily. Nathan had known it wouldn't. Cars like this, cars that had survived decades of obscurity, that had outlasted the people who built them and the people who'd owned them and the institutional memory of everyone who'd known what they were. They carried their history in the way scar tissue carried memory. You could feel it in the resistance of seized fasteners and the brittleness of degraded rubber and the specific complaint of aluminum that had been stressed and rested and stressed again over 67 years. The car had its own language of damage, and learning that language was the first month's work. He started with documentation. Every panel photographed before anything was touched, every fastener cataloged by location and condition. He bought a new notebook, the same brand his father had used, a black hardcover Mead that cost $4 at the office supply store 2 blocks from Maya's school, and began filling it the same way his father had filled notebooks, not with impressions or theories, but with facts, measurements, observations stated plainly without editorializing. Left front fender, surface oxidation consistent with long-term storage, no structural deformation. Original paint witness marks visible under wheel arch, color consistent with factory silver gray metallic, that kind of thing. The habit of it was its own discipline, the written record forcing clarity that photographs alone didn't require. The engine was his first real obstacle. The flat four that sat in the rear of the Porsche was, by all external indications, original. The casting numbers matched, the external components were period correct, and the condition suggested it had not been run in a very long time, which given the car's history was expected. What was not expected was the degree to which the internal components had suffered. When Nathan pulled the heads on the third week, he found scoring on two-cylinder walls that was severe enough to require either professional sleeving or replacement with period-correct components, which were not the kind of thing you found on a shelf at the local parts supplier. They were the kind of thing you found through a network of specialists and collectors and patient correspondents, and they cost accordingly. He called Marcus Webb. "I need machine work," he said, "precision stuff. Cylinder sleeving on a flat 4 1950s vintage. The tolerances on this thing are, it's not like working on American iron." Marcus came over that evening after closing the shop and crouched over the engine on its stand for a while, occasionally asking Nathan questions and occasionally just looking. Marcus was big in the way that former linemen were big. Not fat, but occupying space with authority. And he had hands that looked like they'd been assembled for industrial work rather than grown, which made it slightly startling how delicately he handled the components when he examined them. "This is doable," Marcus said finally. "It's not easy, but it's doable. I'll need specs. I'll get you specs. And time. Don't rush me on this." "I'm not rushing anyone on anything," Nathan said, which was true in the sense that all of this was going at the pace the work required, and not a moment faster, and not true in the sense that the legal pressure from Ashcroft Industries was not accelerating, which it was, because Sandra had called that morning to tell him that Gregory Mast had sent a formal letter requesting an independent inspection of the vehicles, which Sandra had declined on the grounds that the vehicles were a legitimate private purchase and no right of inspection existed, which Mast had received without visible reaction, which was the most unsettling possible response. "How's the legal thing going?" Marcus asked, still examining the engine. "Sandra says we're okay for now." But it's a 30-year-old billionaire with a Chicago law firm. The "for now" part has an expiration date I can't see yet. Marcus nodded slowly. "You know what I'd do if I were them?" "No." "I'd wait until the cars were done and worth the most money they're ever going to be worth, and then I'd make a move." Nathan looked at him. "That's a genuinely unpleasant thing to say." "I'm not saying it's what they're doing. I'm saying it's what I'd do." He stood up from the engine stand. "Get me the specs. I'll get started next week." The legal situation had a texture to it that Nathan found exhausting in a way that the physical work didn't. Not because the work wasn't hard, because it was, but because the work had a logic he understood, and the legal situation had a logic that was fundamentally about power rather than evidence. And those were different things. Sandra was good at navigating that terrain, and he trusted her to do it, but trust didn't make the calls less unpleasant or the certified letters less ominous in a pile of regular mail. The second letter from Mast's office arrived in the 9th week and contained language about the potential unauthorized disposition of culturally significant automotive assets, which Sandra called him about within an hour of it presumably arriving at her office too. "What does that mean?" Nathan asked. "It means they found out about the authentication report." Nathan sat down on the stool at his workbench. "How?" "Authentication processes involve multiple people. Specialists in Stuttgart, someone in Modena. These aren't secret societies. Someone talked to someone who knew someone." A pause. "It doesn't change your legal position, but it tells us they're better informed now than they were. They know what they sold. They know what they may have sold, yes. And the language about culturally significant assets is a setup for a different kind of claim. Not breach of contract, but something closer to arguing the sale itself was invalid because the seller lacked full information. It's a stretch, but it's a stretch a good lawyer can make look reasonable. Can they win that argument? Probably not, Sandra said, but they can make it expensive enough that the question of whether they can win becomes less important than the question of whether you can afford to keep fighting. She said it without apology, because it was the truth, and she was the kind of lawyer who thought the truth was more useful than comfort. Nathan, what's the realistic timeline on the restoration? 3 more months, maybe 3.5. What? And the auction? He'd been talking to Meridian's auction contact. Not Meridian the scrapyard, but Meridian Classic International, a Munich-based auction house that was one of the 3 or 4 most prestigious in the world for European collector cars. He'd approached them through Franz Bauer, who had a relationship with their specialist director, and the conversation had been in the very early stages of whether the collection would be accepted into their annual summer sale, which was the most significant event in the European collector calendar. Still in discussion, he said. Speed that up if you can. Getting the collection accepted into a recognized auction is the cleanest resolution. It establishes market value. It's a public process with documentation, and it significantly limits Ashcroft's ability to argue the cars were improperly disposed of. Once the gavel comes down, the transaction is final in every meaningful sense. I know. Focus on finishing the cars, Nathan. The faster they're done, the faster this ends. He went back to work. The Lancia came together first, in the 10th week. Nathan sprayed the final coat of Flamma Blue in his makeshift spray booth. Heavy-duty plastic sheeting suspended from the rafters on a system of hooks he'd installed himself. And when he peeled the masking paper away from the chrome trim and the glass and stood back, the car looked like something that had been asleep for 30 years and had just opened its eyes. The color was exactly right. He'd mixed it himself from a period-correct formula he'd sourced through an Italian specialist who charged what felt like a significant fraction of his remaining budget and was worth every cent. Under the workshop lights, the blue had a depth to it that paint applied by spray gun didn't usually have. You had to be patient with it, multiple thin coats with proper flash time between them, resisting the temptation to lay it on heavy and call it done. He took a photograph, put it in the documentation file, allowed himself 30 seconds of satisfaction, and then started on the next problem. The Mercedes 300 SL was the most technically complex of the 4 primary vehicles, because the 300 SL was a technically complex automobile by any standard. Its space frame chassis and unique door configuration required specific knowledge and tooling that Nathan had spent years accumulating, partly because he'd always believed he'd eventually work on one, and partly because his father had worked on 2 during his career and had documented everything. Raymond Carter's notebooks, 12 of them in total, and stored in a plastic bin on the shelf above Nathan's workbench, contained detailed notes on both 300 SL restorations, including the specific challenges of the injection system and the suspension geometry and the gull-wing door adjustment process. Nathan consulted those notebooks the way some people consulted manuals, which in a sense was exactly what they were. Working from his father's notes felt strange, and also not strange at all, like receiving instructions from someone who knew you well enough to anticipate what you'd struggle with. His father had written, "Pay attention to the left door hinge lower pin. It's always the problem," in a note that appeared to have been added after the fact, in different ink, as if Raymond Carter had fixed the problem first, and then remembered to warn the next person. Nathan found the lower pin in exactly the condition the note predicted, spent 45 minutes addressing it, and thought about how his father had essentially reached forward through time to save him that particular frustration. He told Maya about it at dinner that night. She listened with her chin in her hand the way she did when something interested her, but she was also tired. "He fixed it so you wouldn't have to figure it out again," she said. "More or less." "That's what notes are for," she said, with the authority of someone who took notes in class and had opinions about their utility. "When they're good notes, yeah." "Are Grandpa's notes good?" "Grandpa's notes," Nathan said, "are very good." She considered this for a moment, then, "I should start keeping better notes." "On what?" "Everything," she said, as if this were obvious, and went back to her dinner. He laughed, and it was a real laugh, and he realized he hadn't laughed like that in a few weeks. The work had a way of narrowing your field of vision until the things outside the workshop stopped registering properly. And that narrowing was both what made it possible to do what he was doing and also, eventually, a problem. You forgot to look up. You forgot there was a world past the rolling door. Patrice came by on a Sunday in the 12th week without calling first, which was her way of checking on things she suspected wouldn't look the same if she announced herself in advance. She walked in on Nathan lying under the Citroen on a creeper, one arm up into the hydraulic system, talking to the car in a low voice that she described later as concerning. Who are you talking to? She said. I'm explaining to it what I'm trying to do, he said from under the car. It helps. You're explaining hydraulics to a French automobile. The hydraulics are French, yes. It helps to explain things in a sympathetic tone. Patrice stood for a moment, looking at the workshop. The 4 cars in various stages, the organized rows of components on labeled shelves, the notebooks stacked by the bench, the general evidence of a man who had disappeared into a project to the exclusion of almost everything else. Then she picked up a folding chair from against the wall and sat down. You look terrible, she said. Thank you. I'm serious. When did you last sleep a full night? Define full. Nathan. He came out from under the citron, sat up on the creeper, and looked at his sister. She looked back at him with an expression that combined affection and genuine concern in a ratio that had shifted over the past few weeks toward the latter. He knew she was right. He could feel it in the specific heaviness of his arms, the way small decisions took slightly longer than they should, the tendency to read the same line of a parts catalog 3 times before it registered. He was running on the residue of adrenaline and stubbornness, which were both renewable but not unlimited. 3 more months, he said, maybe less. And until then? Until then, I do what I'm doing. Maya said you've been in the workshop until midnight twice this week. Maya is 7. Maya is observant, and she worries about you in the specific way that kids worry when they don't fully understand what's happening, but they can tell something is. That landed. He looked at the citron. I'll talk to her. Talk to her tonight. Not after you finish the hydraulics. After I finish the hydraulics, he said. They're almost done, and if I stop now, I have to drain the system and start over. Patrice looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up a folding chair, moved it to the citron's front end, and sat down. Then finish the hydraulics. I'll wait. He went back under the car. It was quiet in the workshop for a while. Just the sound of tools and the occasional creak of the building, and from outside the distant sound of a neighborhood Sunday, lawnmowers and someone's music and a dog. Patrice, he said from under the car. Yeah. Thank you for the loan. I know it wasn't, you'll pay me back. I will. With interest, she said. You didn't say interest. I'm saying it now. He could hear the smile in it, and he was glad he was under the car so she couldn't see his face, which was doing something complicated. Fine, he said. Interest. The breakthrough with the Porsche came in the 14th week, and it came not from the mechanical work, which was progressing steadily under Marcus's supervision at the machine shop, but from provenance research that Franz Bauer had been quietly pursuing in parallel with the restoration. Franz called on a Tuesday morning with what Nathan had learned to recognize as the old man's version of excitement, a controlled quickening, a precision in the phrasing that meant he was working to contain something he didn't want to overstate. I found the intermediate ownership, Franz said, between 1969 and 1978. Nathan set down his coffee. How? I have been in correspondence with the estate of a man in Palermo, a lawyer, now deceased, who represented several of the Vasari estate sales. His son found letters in the estate archive that document a private sale to a Swiss intermediary in 1970. The intermediary's name is documented. The car was transported to Geneva in early 1971. From Geneva, it appears to have been sold to an American collector, not Swiss, who was resident in Geneva at the time for business reasons. Who? A man named Harrison Wellfield. He was in the petroleum industry based in Houston. He died in 1989. His estate was handled by a firm in Houston that no longer exists, and the collection was dispersed through private sales rather than auction. A pause. I believe the car came to the Ashcroft family through Harrison Wellfield, through a transaction that was not publicly documented. Evelyn Ashcroft's grandfather, Nathan said. The collector. Yes. If Wellfield and the Ashcroft patriarch were connected through the petroleum industry, which, given the timeline, is plausible, a private sale between them would explain how the car disappeared from European documentation and reappeared in a locked-out building in Westfield, Oregon. Nathan sat with this for a moment. The car had a life. It had crossed the ocean twice, lived in Switzerland, spent years in Texas or Oregon, ended up forgotten in a storage building on a commercial property. 67 years of existence, most of it invisible. This is good news for authentication, Franz continued, and less good news for your legal situation, because it gives the Ashcroft family a documented chain of legitimate ownership that their lawyers will use to argue the car was a genuine asset rather than abandoned property. Sandra already knows about the legal angle, Nathan said. Send me everything. I'll forward it to her. Nathan. The old man's voice shifted slightly. The Vasari car has a story that people in this industry have been trying to tell for 50 years. Whatever happens with the legal matter, the story exists now. The car exists. You found it. It was going to be crushed, Nathan said. Yes, and it wasn't. A pause. That matters. He forwarded the provenance documents to Sandra the same afternoon. She called back within 2 hours. This helps us and doesn't help us, she said, which was becoming her standard opening. The ownership chain makes the car's history clearer, but it also gives Ashcroft's lawyers more material to work with. They'll argue the car was a valuable family asset that was disposed of in error. Was it disposed of in error? From their perspective? Almost certainly. From a legal standpoint, the disposal was authorized by Evelyn Ashcroft, who was the legal owner of Ashcroft Industries, who owned the Westfield property, who authorized Meridian to collect and process the vehicles. Error is not a legal category that voids a legitimate transaction. So we're okay. We're okay for now. But Nathan, I want to move up the timeline on the auction if possible. Get me a date. He called the contact at Meridian Classic International, a woman named Hilda Brenner, the specialist director Franz had introduced him to, who had the calm precision of someone who had worked with objects worth millions of dollars for so long that the numbers had ceased to produce any particular emotional response in her. He'd been in correspondence with her for 6 weeks, gradually providing documentation as the authentication process progressed. The collection is accepted, Hilda told him, in the flat declarative way she stated most things. Pending final photographs of completed restorations. We have a slot in the July sale. That's 4 months. Correct. Can you deliver completed vehicles by the end of June? He calculated. 3 months of work remaining by his own estimate. June was tight. June was not impossible. Yes, he said. I'll send you the consignment agreement this week. He looked up from his phone at the workshop. The 4 cars, the Porsche, with its engine currently absent and sitting on Marcus's machine shop floor, the notebooks and the tools and the overhead lights that he'd replaced with better ones in the second week because the original fluorescence had been uneven and color-matching paint under uneven light was how you made expensive mistakes. 4 months. He went back to work. The news that the collection would be offered at Meridian Classic International's July sale became public 6 weeks later, in the form of a press release that the auction house issued as standard practice for significant consignments. Nathan had known it was coming and had told Sandra and Patrice in advance, but knowing something is coming doesn't fully prepare you for the morning. You wake up and it's in the world. The press release was careful. Auction houses were always careful because their credibility depended on precision. But the description of the Vasari spider, even in the restrained language of professional auction documentation, was enough. A one-off factory development variant, authenticated by independent specialists and newly recovered after decades of absence from documented provenance. The automotive press picked it up within 48 hours. By the end of the week, 3 major publications had run articles. One of them ran a photograph of the car as it had arrived at Nathan's workshop, gray and oxidized, sitting inert on the flatbed, alongside a factory photograph of the original 550 program from 1957. And the juxtaposition was the kind of thing that spread quickly among people who cared about such things. Nathan did not read the articles. He had a policy about this, which was that reading things people said about your work while the work wasn't finished was the fastest way to start doing the work for the wrong reasons. He knew the articles existed. He did not open them. What he did read was the letter from Gregory Mast that arrived on the Thursday of that same week, which was longer than the previous letters and contained specific legal language about the right to seek injunctive relief and the intention to pursue all available remedies. Sandra called him before he'd finished reading it. I saw it, she said. Don't panic. I'm not panicking. You sound like you're about to. I'm reading carefully. Read less carefully and call me when you're done. There are things in there I need to walk you through. A pause. And Nathan, the press coverage changes the dynamic. They were slow walking this because they weren't sure what they had. Now they know exactly what they had. And the whole industry knows, and the whole industry is going to be watching the July sale. Her voice was measured, deliberate. This is actually a protection. Public transactions are harder to unwind than private ones. So the auction is a shield. The auction, Sandra said, is the finish line. Get across it. He worked through March with a focus that surprised even him, which was saying something given that focus was generally not his problem. The Citroen's hydraulics were complete, and when Nathan lowered the car onto its suspension properly for the first time and watched it settle and rise in the specific way that made the DS one of the most remarkable driving experiences in automotive history, he stood back and allowed himself a moment of genuine feeling about it. Not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. The satisfaction of having done a thing correctly that was genuinely difficult to do correctly. The car looked right. It sat right. The suspension's characteristic rising movement, that slow pneumatic lift that had been astonishing to automotive journalists in 1955 when the car was first shown, still worked as its designers had intended. He photographed it extensively and sent the photographs to Hilda Brenner, who responded within an hour. Excellent. The other three? The Mercedes came together in April. The bodywork on the driver's door had been the last significant challenge. The wrong filler compound used in the old repair had created a stress differential that Nathan had addressed over several weeks of careful work, and the final metal shaping had required him to call in a favor from a man named Pete Ortega in Seattle, who was one of the better panel men on the West Coast and who owed Nathan a favor from a transmission problem 3 years prior. Pete drove down on a Saturday, spent 6 hours on the door, collected cash and a case of beer, and drove home. The paint match was Nathan's work. He'd consulted his father's notes, mixed the original graphite gray formula, and sprayed it over 2 sessions with a day of cure time between them. In the workshop light, you could not find the repair. He knew where it was. He photographed it from 6 angles. The Alfa Romeo was mechanically straightforward relative to the others, but the interior was the challenge. The original seat material had deteriorated beyond any reasonable prospect of restoration, and finding a period-correct replacement in the right color and texture had taken Nathan 4 weeks of correspondence with 3 different specialists before he'd found a woman in Bologna who had a supply of original period material that she sold in small quantities for exactly this kind of work. The shipping cost more than the material. He paid it without complaint. May was the Porsche. Marcus delivered the engine in the first week of May, rebuilt to original specifications with the cylinder sleeving done to tolerances that Nathan verified himself with measuring tools before signing off. Marcus had done good work. Better than good, careful and precise in a way that showed he'd understood what the job required, even if he hadn't fully understood what the car was. Nathan thanked him and paid the invoice, and then spent a Saturday installing the engine with the focus ceremony that significant moment sometimes acquired, the way a thing felt different when you understood its weight. The first start was in the second week of May. He'd done everything right. He knew he'd done everything right because he'd checked everything twice and documented each step, and there was no rational reason for it not to start. And yet there was always this moment, the moment before, when all the knowledge and preparation in the world stood aside and left you with something that was purely about whether it worked or it didn't, and no amount of expertise made that moment anything other than what it was. He turned the key. The flat 4 caught on the third crank, rough and uncertain for a few seconds, and then settled into a sound that Nathan had no adequate words for, not because it was beautiful in the way that the word beautiful usually got used, but because it was correct. It sounded like what it was. It sounded like 1957. He sat in the driver's seat with the engine running and his hands on the wheel that he'd restored, and for a moment he let himself feel everything he'd been keeping manageable for 6 months. The exhaustion and the anxiety and the legal threat and the loneliness of doing enormous work in a small shop without anyone to see it, and underneath all of that, clear and simple, the thing his father had tried to give him all those Saturday mornings in this same building. The gift of pattern. The ability to recognize what something was before anyone else could see it. He sat in the car for about 3 minutes. Then he shut off the engine, picked up his camera, and began the final documentation session. He had 6 weeks until the cars needed to be on a truck to Munich. He had work to do. The truck came on a Thursday morning in the last week of June, earlier than Nathan had expected, which meant he was still in the workshop at 6:30 when the driver knocked on the rolling door. A young guy named Brett, who had the particular calm of someone accustomed to transporting things worth more than he'd earn in a decade, and had made his peace with that. Nathan had been there since 4. Not because there was work left to do. There wasn't, not really. The cars were done, had been done for 9 days, but because he hadn't been able to stay away from them. He'd been coming in early and staying late in the way you visited someone in a hospital before a long trip, knowing the visit wasn't strictly necessary but needing it anyway. The 5 cars sat under clean cotton covers in the morning dark of the workshop, and Nathan pulled each cover off slowly while Brett and his partner, an older guy who said nothing and moved with the efficiency of someone who'd loaded a lot of things onto a lot of trucks, backed the transport trailer into position. The ramps came down with a hydraulic whir, and Nathan watched the Lancia go up first, and then the Citroën, and then the Mercedes, and then the Alfa Romeo. Each one strapped down with professional care, covered with protective blankets. The Porsche went last. Brett stood at the bottom of the ramp while Nathan guided the car up from behind, and neither of them said anything, which was the right call. There were moments that didn't need narration, and this was one. When the car was strapped and covered and the ramp came back up, Nathan stood at the rear of the trailer for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets. "You okay?" Brett asked. "Yeah," Nathan said. "How long to Munich?" "We cross to Hamburg by ship out of Baltimore, usually about 3 weeks door to door." 3 weeks? The collection would arrive at the Meridian Classic International Facility in Munich, with enough time for the specialists to do their pre-sale inspection and the catalog photographers to do their work before the July sale. Nathan had submitted photographs already. The auction house had been receiving documentation updates throughout the process. But the physical inspection was its own event, and Hilda Brenner had made clear she intended to be present for it. He watched the truck pull out of his driveway and turn onto the street, and then it was gone. And the workshop behind him was empty, in a way it hadn't been in 6 months. He stood in the driveway for a while. The neighborhood was waking up around him, a light coming on in the house across the street, someone's sprinkler system starting its morning cycle, a dog being walked by a woman in running clothes who nodded at Nathan without slowing down. Ordinary morning, ordinary neighborhood. Completely ordinary except for the fact that 5 historically significant automobiles had just left in a truck headed for Baltimore, and in 3 weeks they'd be in Germany, and in 4 weeks they'd either sell or they wouldn't. His phone buzzed. Sandra. "They're gone?" she said when he picked up. "Just left." "Good. Gregory Mast called me yesterday evening." He walked back into the workshop. "And?" "They're not going to seek an injunction. The window for that closed legally. There's a filing deadline, and they missed it, which I believe was a deliberate strategic decision on their part." "Why deliberate?" "Because an injunction would have required them to go on record claiming a legal interest in cars they voluntarily authorized for demolition. The optics of that, especially with the press coverage, would have been damaging. The Ashcroft brand is luxury automotive. Being publicly identified as the company that tried to crush the Vasari Spider is not the story they want associated with the name. So they're just going to watch. They're going to watch the auction. After the auction, Mast suggested they might want to have a conversation about a settlement. Nathan sat down on the stool at his workbench. The workshop smelled different with the cars gone. Just the chemical smell now, and the concrete, and old oil. What kind of settlement? He wasn't specific. I think they're waiting to see what the sale produces before they decide what number to put on it. My read is they believe they have some claim, but they know it's weak, and they're hoping you'll pay them something to make them go away." "Will I have to?" A pause. "No, but you may choose to, depending on what the sale looks like and what your appetite for continued legal friction is." She said it without judgment, which he appreciated. "You'll have options after the sale. Let's get through the sale first." He looked at the empty workshop for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, let's get through the sale." He spent the 3 weeks before the auction doing something he hadn't done properly in 6 months, which was everything else. He returned calls he'd been deferring. He serviced the transit, which had been accumulating small, neglected complaints, a rear brake that was slightly soft, a belt that had developed a noise he'd been ignoring. He slept more than 4 hours a night, which felt strange, and then felt necessary. He took Maya to her friend Audrey's birthday party and stood by the snack table talking to Audrey's father, who worked in software and wanted to talk about a project management app he'd been using. And Nathan listened and nodded and ate 3 pieces of birthday cake because he'd forgotten to eat lunch. He called Patrice and had a normal conversation. Not about the cars, not about the legal situation, just a conversation. She was planning a trip to see their aunt in Tucson. She'd started doing yoga, which she said Nathan would probably find annoying to hear. He found it mildly annoying, which she apparently expected. He sat in Maya's room one night after she was asleep and looked at her bookshelf, which contained, in addition to the expected children's chapter books, and 2 stuffed animals that had been retired from active use but remained in honorary positions, a growing row of small composition notebooks. 7 of them, at current count, each labeled in Maya's handwriting on the spine. He picked one up and opened it. She'd told him he could read them, which he understood was a specific permission she'd extended and not a general one. The notebook was about cars, his cars mostly, observations she'd made in the workshop, questions she'd been afraid were too basic to ask out loud, answers she'd found in books she'd pulled from his shelf. There were drawings, not beautiful, but accurate. The kind of drawings a kid made when they were trying to understand the structure of something rather than represent it aesthetically. A sketch of the Citroën suspension schematic, copied from one of his technical manuals. A diagram of a flat-4 engine layout with the cylinders labeled. He put the notebook back carefully, exactly where it had been. The greatest inheritance he could give her was not wealth. He'd understood that as a principle for a long time. Seeing it written out in a 7-year-old's handwriting in a composition notebook on a bookshelf made it feel different from a principle. It felt true in a way that principles sometimes didn't. The Meridian Classic International July sale was held on a Saturday, and Nathan flew to Munich on the preceding Wednesday with Maya, who had never been to Europe and approached the prospect with the methodical enthusiasm of someone who had been making a list of questions for 3 weeks. "Why do they drive on the right side?" she asked on the plane, somewhere over the Atlantic. "Germans drive on the right. The British drive on the left." "Why?" "Different historical reasons." "What reasons?" "I'll get you a book." "I want you to tell me." "I don't fully know, Maya. That's an honest answer." She accepted this with better grace than he might have at her age. She'd brought one of her notebooks and spent part of the flight writing in it, which Nathan didn't look at but could see from the corner of his eye had both words and drawings in it. They arrived in Munich Thursday morning and checked into a hotel near the Meridian facility that Nathan had chosen because it was clean and reasonably priced and within walking distance of a bakery that had been recommended by Franz Bauer, who knew Munich well and had opinions about bread that Nathan took seriously. Franz was in Munich for the sale, had flown in from Stuttgart at Nathan's invitation, at Nathan's expense, because it felt right to have him there. They met for dinner Thursday evening at a restaurant near the city center, the old man and Nathan and Maya, and Franz ordered things for all of them in German and told Maya, in careful English, about the history of the cars she'd watched her father work on for 6 months. Maya asked questions, real ones, specific ones, the kind that showed she'd been paying attention in the workshop and in her notebooks. Franz answered each one with the seriousness it deserved, and Nathan watched the old historian talk to his daughter and felt something that he didn't fully name, but that had to do with continuity, with the way knowledge moved between people if the people bothered to make the time for it. "Your father's father," Franz said to Maya, "taught your father the same way I'm talking to you now, by explaining, by assuming you were capable of understanding." "Did you know my grandpa?" Maya asked. "I knew him for 30 years, Franz said. "He was better than most people I've met in this industry, and I've met most of them." Maya nodded. "My dad's got his notebooks," she said. "I know," Franz said, and looked at Nathan. 12 of them. 12, Nathan confirmed. "You should write your own," Franz said, back to Maya. 12 is a good start. You could do better." Maya considered this with appropriate gravity. "I have 7, she said. "Then you have work to do," Franz said, and refilled his wine glass and ordered Maya a second dessert that she probably didn't need, but that seemed, given the circumstances, like the right call. The preview of the collection was held Friday afternoon, and Nathan stood in the Meridian facility's main hall, a vast, climate-controlled space with gallery lighting and polished concrete floors, and saw the 5 cars as they would appear to the world for the first time. He had seen each of them in every possible state of disassembly and reconstruction. He had seen them covered in primer and stripped to bare metal and in pieces on workbench surfaces. He had never seen them like this, clean, complete, lit properly, arranged with deliberate intention to show what they were. They were, collectively, extraordinary. Not because they were perfect, they weren't, and Nathan had made a conscious decision during the restoration that he wouldn't make them perfect, because perfect was a lie that restoration sometimes told at the expense of truth. The Lancia had a small scar on the left rear fender, under the paint, that showed in certain light as a slight irregularity in the surface. He'd left it. The car had earned it. The Citroen's interior showed the age of the materials in a way that was honest about what the car was and when it had been made. The Alfa's steering wheel had a crack in the rim that a previous owner had repaired with a period-correct wrap technique, and Nathan had kept the wrap rather than replacing the wheel because the repair was old enough to be history rather than damage. And the Porsche sat at the end of the row, small and silver gray, and completely itself. Hilda Brenner appeared at Nathan's elbow. She was a tall woman, mid-50s, with short silver hair and the quiet authority of someone who had been standing in rooms like this with significant objects for a very long time. "The specialist team has been through them," she said. "There are no concerns." "I know. The Citroen is generating more interest than I expected. There's a buyer from Lyon who called twice." "Good car," Nathan said. "The Lancia has a registered bidder from Tokyo." She paused. "And the Spider has 7 registered bidders from 4 countries, and the reserve is already covered by 3 of them based on pre-sale interest." Nathan looked at the Porsche. "What are you expecting?" Hilda was quiet for a moment, which from her was a specific kind of answer. "The pre-sale estimate in the catalog is 1.2 to 1.8 million, she said. "That estimate is conservative. It's what I could justify with comparable sales data, of which there is very little, because there is nothing truly comparable." She looked at the car. "What I expect and what I can put in print are different things. I've been doing this for 23 years, and I have learned to be wrong about rooms." "What does wrong look like in a room like this?" "Sometimes quieter than you expect," she said. "Sometimes considerably louder." He didn't sleep well Friday night, which was something he'd prepared himself for. He lay in the hotel room while Maya slept in the other bed with the absolute unconscious commitment of someone who had no particular anxiety about tomorrow. And he stared at the ceiling and thought about things that weren't useful to think about, which was the nature of sleepless nights. He thought about the scrapyard and the press and Wayne Dressel's reading glasses and the sound the Porsche's engine had made on the first start. He thought about his father's handwriting in 12 notebooks on a shelf above a workbench in Portland. He thought about Gregory Mast and what Sandra had said about settlement conversations. At some point after 2 in the morning, he stopped trying to sleep and got up and sat by the window and watched the Munich street below, which had the particular quiet of a European city at that hour. Different from Portland's quiet, more compressed. The buildings older and closer together. The silence more layered. He was, he realized, afraid. Not of the auction going badly. At this point, the documentation was airtight and the reserve was covered, and the worst realistic outcome was still a significant financial result. He was afraid of it being over. Of the thing he'd been doing for 6 months being done. The purpose that had organized his days and nights and justified the exhaustion and the legal anxiety and the missed lunches and the dark circles that Maya had started commenting on with the frank observational quality that was her particular gift. He was afraid of the empty workshop. It was a stupid thing to be afraid of, and he knew it, and he was afraid of it anyway. The auction began at 11 on Saturday morning. The sale room held perhaps 200 people, and it was full, and there were bidding paddles in the room and phones on long tables at the sides where staff relayed bids from remote buyers. Nathan sat in the eighth row with Maya on one side and Franz Bauer on the other, which felt like the right arrangement. Patrice had wanted to come, had asked 3 times, but had ultimately stayed in Portland because someone had to be available for the practical things, which was a sentence she'd said with the kind of resigned practicality that was its own form of love. He'd saved her a chair in spirit. The first car to sell was a pre-war Bugatti that had nothing to do with Nathan's collection, and it sold for just over 400,000 euros to a paddle in the room. Then a post-war Ferrari, then a pair of Alfa Romeos from a Swiss estate. Nathan watched the room, the way paddles moved, the rhythm of the bidding, the body language of the specialists at the phone tables, trying to calibrate what kind of room it was, what the mood was, whether the bidders had come ready to spend or ready to be cautious. The room felt warm, not recklessly so, but willing. The Citroën went first among Nathan's cars at 20 minutes past noon. The estimate had been 60 to 90,000 euros. The bidding started at 50 and climbed past the high estimate in 90 seconds, and the phone table at the right side of the room was involved from the beginning. And when the hammer came down at 142,000 euros, the room made a small collective sound. Not applause, just a murmur, the sound of a room recalibrating its sense of how the afternoon was going to go. Beside Nathan, Franz Bauer made a brief sound that might have been satisfaction. The Alfa Romeo was next. Estimate 80 to 120,000. It sold to a paddle 3 rows ahead of Nathan for 195,000, which was 65,000 over the high estimate. And now the room had a different quality. More alert, paddles held with slightly more readiness, the phone staff sitting straighter. The Lancia brought 230,000, 100,000 over the high estimate, to the buyer from Tokyo who had registered before the sale. Nathan watched the paddle go up in the front row, a precise and unhurried movement, and the auctioneer worked the room through 4 more bids before the hammer fell, and the Japanese buyer didn't react visibly, which was either cultural restraint or the practiced composure of someone who'd done this before. He turned to Maya and found her watching the room with the focused attention she brought to things that interested her, her small notebook open on her knee and her pen moving. "What are you writing?" he said quietly. "What the room looks like," she said, without looking up. "How people hold the paddles, the way it gets quiet right before the bid." He looked at her for a moment, then he looked back at the front. The Mercedes 300 SL went immediately after a short break in the proceedings. The estimate had been 400 to 600,000 euros, which was conservative by the standards of the 300 SL market, but justified by the car's condition history, which the catalog had documented honestly. The bidding opened at 350 and went past the high estimate in under 2 minutes, the paddles in the room competing with 2 phone lines that were both running simultaneously. At 750 it was down to 1 paddle, a man in the 5th row whom Nathan couldn't see clearly from the 8th, and 1 phone. At 820 the phone dropped out, and the man in the 5th row put down his paddle and the gavel came down. Nathan felt Franz's hand on his arm briefly. Just a touch, the old man's version of acknowledgement. And then it was gone. 820,000 euros for the Mercedes. Significantly overestimate. The murmur in the room was louder this time. Then there was a pause in the proceedings. A deliberate one, because the Meridian specialists understood room management, understood that a significant lot required a moment of dedicated attention that back-to-back selling didn't allow. The auctioneer spoke briefly. The provenance, the authentication, the history of the car's disappearance and recovery. And Nathan listened to his own collection being described in a room of 200 people and felt the strange dissociation of something that had been entirely private becoming entirely public. He had not looked at the Ashcroft section of the room. He knew they were there. Sandra had told him that Evelyn Ashcroft had registered as a sale observer, not a bidder, and that Gregory Mast was likely present as well, though he couldn't confirm. He hadn't looked because looking felt like it would change something about how he sat in that chair, and he needed to sit in that chair correctly. The bidding on the Vasari Spider opened at 800,000 euros. 3 paddles went up in the room immediately, 2 phone lines. The opening pace was faster than any of the previous cars, the bids climbing in increments of 50,000, and then, past the million mark, in increments of 100,000. At 1,300,000, 1 paddle in the room dropped, At $1,500,000, a second phone dropped. At $1,800,000, the top of the estimate range, there were still 2 paddles and 1 phone active, and the room had gone very quiet in the specific way that rooms went quiet when something was happening that people wanted to be able to say they witnessed. At $2,000,000, one of the paddles dropped. It was the man in the front row. Nathan could see him now, older, gray-suited, who put his paddle on his knee with the resignation of someone who'd made a decision about his limit and was keeping it. The bidding continued between a single paddle in the middle of the room and the right-side phone table, climbing in 50,000 increments that felt, in the quiet of the room, enormous. Maya had stopped writing. She was just watching, her pen resting against the open notebook, her whole body oriented toward the front of the room with an attention that Nathan recognized as the same quality his father had described in him once, years ago, in a context he'd forgotten, but that now felt suddenly close. 2.4 million, 2.45, 2.5. The paddle in the middle of the room went up for 2.55, and the phone table specialist, a young woman with red-framed glasses who had been maintaining the same expression throughout, said something quietly into her handset, and there was a pause, and she raised her hand, and the auctioneer said 2.6, and the paddle in the middle of the room went up again without hesitation. 2.65 from the phone, 2.7 from the paddle. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. 2.75 from the phone. The specialist with the red-framed glasses said it with the same measured calm she'd been using since the bidding opened. The paddle in the middle of the room was still. Nathan watched the man holding it. Couldn't see his face from this angle, just the back of his head and the paddle resting against his knee. And the auctioneer asked for 2.8 with the particular cadence that meant this was a decision point, and the paddle went up. 2.8, the phone table. The specialist with the red-framed glasses spoke quietly into the handset for a longer moment than before. Then she set the handset down on the table in front of her. The auctioneer looked at the room, said 2.8 twice more, in the measured ritual of the process. Then the gavel came down. 2,800,000 euros. The room released its breath. Not applause. That wasn't the culture, exactly. But sound. The aggregate sound of 200 people reacting to what they'd just watched. And Franz Bauer said something in German that Nathan didn't catch. And beside him, Maya took a breath and let it out slowly and said, very quietly, "Wow." Nathan sat in his chair and felt the numbers settle into him. The combined total for the 5 cars came to just under 5 million euros by the time the final hammer fell, which Hilda Brenner communicated to him in the reception area afterward with the satisfied expression of someone whose conservative estimates had been made to look appropriately conservative. She shook his hand and said, "Exceptional work," in a tone that told him she didn't say it often and meant it when she did. Franz found him a few minutes later and said nothing, just put his hand on Nathan's shoulder for a moment, which from Franz Bauer was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Maya was holding her notebook open to a page that was half written and half drawn, and she showed it to Nathan with the directness that characterized most of what she did. Not seeking approval, exactly, just sharing the thing. He looked at the page. She'd drawn the room from memory, the rows of seats and the phone tables and the front where the auctioneer stood, and she'd written down the final number with 3 underlines under it. "Is that right?" she said. "The number?" "That's right," he said. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook. "What happens to the cars now?" "They go to the people who bought them." "The Porsche too?" "The Porsche too." She was quiet for a second. "Are you sad?" He thought about it honestly rather than answering quickly, which was something he'd always tried to do when she asked a real question. "A little," he said, "but that's not the point of them. The point was finding them and doing the work." She nodded slowly, in the way she nodded when she was filing something for later, rather than fully agreeing in the moment. "Okay," she said. He saw Evelyn Ashcroft at the edge of the reception area, which was where he'd known this would happen. The same way you knew certain conversations were coming and couldn't quite prepare for them regardless. She was standing slightly apart from the crowd, which was not an accident. A woman in her position rarely stood anywhere by accident, and she was watching the room with an expression that Nathan found difficult to read from across a space of 20 feet. She looked younger than 30 in person, which was not what he'd expected. and also tired in a specific way that wasn't about sleep. Gregory Mast was nearby, but not beside her. He was talking to another man in a suit near the entrance, and his attention was on that conversation, which meant that when Evelyn started walking toward Nathan, it was on her own initiative and without her lawyer in her peripheral vision. Nathan noticed this. He suspected it was intentional. She stopped about 3 feet away from him, which was a professional distance. Not aggressive, not warm. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Ms. Ashcroft." Maya was looking up at her with the unfiltered attention of a 7-year-old who hadn't yet learned that staring was considered rude, which Nathan was about to address when Evelyn glanced down at Maya and something in her expression shifted slightly, became less prepared. "Hi," Maya said. "Hi," Evelyn said. "I'm Maya." "I know, I'm Evelyn." Maya looked at her for another moment. "You owned the cars," she said. Not an accusation, just a fact. "I did," Evelyn said, "for a few years, without knowing much about them." Maya considered this. "My dad knew," she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He did." She looked back up at Nathan. "Can we talk for a few minutes?" He looked at Franz, who was nearby, and Franz gave him a look that communicated both that he'd watched Maya and that he found the situation interesting. Nathan said to Maya, "Stay with Franz, okay? I'll be close." "Okay," Maya said, already turning toward Franz with some questions she'd been saving. Nathan and Evelyn walked a few feet away from the main cluster of the reception into a quieter section near a window that overlooked the Meridian Facilities parking area. Outside, a transport driver was securing something to a trailer with the methodical unhurriedness of someone who had all the time in the world. "I want to say something," Evelyn said, "and I want to say it without Gregory nearby because what I'm going to say is not a legal strategy, and I don't want it misunderstood as one." "Okay," Nathan said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the window rather than him. "I made a careless decision," she said, "not a fast one. It wasn't like I looked at the list for 10 seconds and said get rid of them. I spent probably 2 minutes thinking about it, which is worse in a way because 2 minutes felt like due diligence." She paused. "I knew my grandfather collected things. I didn't know what he collected or why. I inherited a building full of his things, and I was managing 3 other properties and a licensing dispute, and a board that wanted me to divest anything that wasn't core to operations. The cars were in a building I'd been inside once. They looked like old things under tarps." "They were old things under tarps," Nathan said. "They were worth $5 million, she said. "That's a different fact." She looked at him then. She had the eyes of someone who was genuinely frustrated with themselves, which was a specific and, he thought, not very common thing to see in someone's expression when they were discussing something they'd lost. "What I didn't do," she said, "was ask the question, what are they? Just that. I didn't ask it." She was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather would have been horrified. He spent 40 years learning about those cars, finding them, preserving them. He never talked to me about them. I was young when he died, and maybe he thought he had more time. But that collection was something he cared about seriously, and I let it go to a scrapyard without asking one question." Nathan looked at her. She was not performing remorse. He'd seen enough perform things in enough situations to distinguish. She was actually sitting in it, which was both more uncomfortable and more interesting. "You're not here to threaten a legal claim," he said. "No," she said. "Gregory will probably send Sandra another letter next week. That's Gregory's job, and he'll do it, and eventually there'll be a number that makes it go away, and you shouldn't pay it because your legal position is stronger than ours, and we both know it." She said it matter-of-factly, like reading a weather report. "I'm here because I watched those cars sell today, and I realized that the worst part of what happened isn't the money." "What is it?" "The worst part is that I owned something that belonged to a story I didn't know. And the story exists now. I watched it happen today, in that room. And it exists because you followed a truck to a scrapyard and asked the question I didn't ask." She stopped. Looked toward the area where Maya was standing with Franz, the old man, and the girl in what appeared to be a detailed conversation, Maya's notebook open. "Your daughter was writing in her notebook through the whole sale." "She takes notes," Nathan said. "I noticed." Something moved in Evelyn's expression that he couldn't quite name. What was she writing? What the room looked like, he said. How people hold the paddles, the way it gets quiet before the bid. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, like she'd been given an answer to something she'd asked herself rather than him. I owe you an apology, she said. Not a legal one, just a human one. You saved something that should never have been in a position to need saving. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather found those cars, he said. Whatever the chain was, however they got from Europe to Oregon, he found them and kept them. That matters. He kept them in a locked building for 30 years without telling anyone, Evelyn said. People keep things for different reasons. Maybe he wasn't ready to let them go. He paused. Or maybe he was waiting for the right moment and ran out of time. She was quiet, looking at the window again. He died before I was old enough to have the conversation, she said. I know what that's like, Nathan said. My father died when I was 24. There were conversations we didn't finish. She looked at him. He hadn't intended to say that. It had come out of somewhere he hadn't entirely planned to open, the way certain things did when you'd spent 6 months under significant pressure and your usual management of what you said was slightly eroded. He didn't take it back. I'm sorry, she said. And it was the second apology in 5 minutes, and this one was simpler and smaller and more genuine, the kind of apology that had nothing to do with 5 million euros. He left notebooks, Nathan said. 12 of them. About the cars he worked on and how he worked on them. The 300 SL that sold today. I found the right way to fix the door hinge from something he wrote down in 1987. Evelyn looked at the window for a long moment. You're saying knowledge is worth passing down. I'm saying it's about the only thing that doesn't depreciate, Nathan said. Money changes. Cars change ownership. Knowledge stays with whoever takes the time to carry it. She was quiet. Then she said, I have another collection. He waited. Through a business acquisition last year, a property in Vermont. The previous owner was a collector, not as serious as my grandfather, but serious. There are vehicles in the storage facility. I haven't looked at them closely. She paused. I was going to have the property management team assess them for disposal. The word disposal sat between them. Don't do that yet, Nathan said. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. She picked up a glass of water from a nearby table, held it without drinking. Would you be willing to look at them before I make any decisions? He considered it, not for long. Call me when you're back in the States, he said, plus we'll set something up. She nodded. Thank you. She started to turn, then stopped. Mr. Carter, what you told your daughter earlier, about the point of the cars being the finding and the work. I heard that from across the room. He didn't say anything. I think that's right, she said. I think that's actually right. She looked once more toward Maya and Franz, the old man and the girl still in conversation, Maya writing something down with her usual focused precision. She's going to be something, that kid. Yeah, Nathan said. I know. Evelyn Ashcroft walked back toward Gregory Mast, who was still talking to the man in the suit and who looked up at her approach with an expression that asked a question she answered with a small shake of her head. Not now. Not here. Not this one. Nathan watched her go. Then he walked back to where Franz and Maya were standing, and the old man looked at him with raised eyebrows that asked a question, and Nathan answered with a small shrug that said later, and Franz nodded and returned to whatever he'd been explaining to Maya, who had not looked up from her notebook and who had, Nathan could see over her shoulder, written 3 lines in her careful handwriting and underlined one of them. He didn't read what she'd underlined. He'd ask her about it later, on the plane, or at dinner, or in the morning over bread from Franz's recommended bakery, because there would be time now. The thing that had compressed the last 6 months into a kind of sustained emergency was done, and what was left was time, which was its own kind of inheritance. He stood beside his daughter in a room in Munich and let the afternoon settle around him. It had been a complicated day, and it wasn't entirely over, and he was tired in a way that had layers to it. But the cars were gone to people who would know what they had. The story that had been buried in a locked building on a commercial property in Westfield, Oregon, existed in the world now, had been told in an auction room to 200 people and would be told again in the documentation and the histories and, eventually, in notebooks. His daughter's notebooks, maybe. Franz's recollections. The catalog entry from Meridian Classic International that would sit in library archives and private collections for as long as people kept such things. Knowledge didn't depreciate. He put his hand briefly on Maya's shoulder, and she leaned into it without looking up from her writing, which was the way she showed affection when she was concentrating, and which Nathan had long understood as its own language, specific and reliable and entirely hers. The afternoon light through the windows was long and gold, the particular quality of summer light in Germany, and somewhere outside the transport driver had finished securing his load and was climbing into the cab of his truck, and the day was winding toward whatever came next. They flew home on a Sunday, and Portland received them with the particular indifference of a city that had been getting on fine without them. Gray skies, light rain, the smell of wet concrete and evergreen that Nathan had always associated with arriving somewhere rather than leaving it. Maya slept through most of the flight and woke up somewhere over the Midwest with her notebook creased against her cheek and a question already forming. "Do you think the people who bought the cars will take care of them?" she asked. "The kind of people who spend that kind of money at that kind of auction generally do," Nathan said. "It's not a guarantee, but it's a reasonable expectation." "What if they just keep them in storage?" "Then they're still not being crushed," he said, "which is better than where they were." She thought about this with the thoroughness she brought to ethical questions. "I guess that's true," she said, in a tone that suggested she was filing it under acceptable but not ideal, which was a reasonable position. He drove home from the airport in the transit, which started on the first try despite 2 weeks of sitting in the driveway, which felt like a minor vote of confidence from the universe. Maya fell asleep again in the passenger seat before they'd cleared the airport road, her head against the window, her notebook still in her lap. He drove through the gray morning without the radio, which he usually had on, because the quiet felt right after the noise of the past week, the auction room, the hotel, the restaurants, Franz's dinner stories and Maya's questions, and Evelyn Ashcroft's voice at the window saying I didn't ask the question. The house was exactly as they'd left it. He carried Maya inside without waking her, which he hadn't been able to do in 2 years because she'd gotten too heavy, and he'd gotten too old for the heroics of it. But he managed it this time through sheer stubbornness and the specific determination of a father who needed to do one thing gently in a week that had contained very few gentle things. He put her in her bed and pulled the blanket up and stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, looking at the bookshelf with its 8 composition notebooks. She'd filled another one in Germany, which she'd told him on the plane with quiet pride, and at the stuffed animals in their honorary positions, and at his daughter sleeping with her hand curled near her face the way she'd slept since she was an infant. He went downstairs and stood in the kitchen and didn't know what to do with himself, which was the most disorienting feeling he'd had in months. The refrigerator needed restocking. There was mail on the counter that Patrice had stacked neatly during their absence. The coffee maker was clean, which meant Patrice had cleaned it, because he'd definitely left it in the state of someone who hadn't had time to clean it. He called her. "You're home," she said when she picked up. "Just got in. Maya's asleep." "How are you?" He leaned against the counter and looked at the kitchen, which was the most ordinary room he'd been in for 2 weeks, and felt, because of that, almost dreamlike. "Weird," he said. "I keep waiting for something to need doing." "Something will need doing," Patrice said. Give it 24 hours. The workshop is empty." "I know. It's the first time in 6 months. Nathan." She said his name with the particular softness she reserved for moments she thought he needed it. Rest. For the first time in 6 months, rest. He wanted to say that resting felt wrong, felt like the momentum of everything stopping too abruptly, felt like something he didn't know how to do anymore. He'd been in sustained forward motion for so long that stopping felt less like relief and more like the ground shifting under him. But he understood that this was not a particularly novel or interesting problem. Lots of people came out the other side of an intense thing and didn't know what to do with the quiet, and that complaining about it to his sister at 8 in the morning after a transatlantic flight was not the solution. "Yeah," he said. "Okay. Eat something," she said. "Sleep. The workshop will still be empty tomorrow, and you can feel bad about it then." He ate leftover crackers and some cheese he found in the back of the refrigerator and went to bed and slept for 11 hours, which was more sleep in one stretch than he'd had since March, and which left him feeling, when he woke up, not rested exactly, but recalibrated, the way a machine felt after maintenance rather than after a vacation. The letter from Gregory Mast's office arrived 3 days after they got home. It was, as Sandra had predicted, a settlement demand. The number it contained was specific and significant, not an opening offer designed to be negotiated down, but a number that had clearly been calculated as the maximum a reasonable person in Nathan's position would consider paying to make a legal threat disappear. It was framed in language about the potential costs of litigation and the mutual benefits of resolution and the Ashcroft family's respect for the work Nathan had done, which was the kind of corporate legal politeness that said everything and nothing simultaneously. Nathan read it twice, set it on the kitchen counter, and called Sandra. "I saw it," she said. "It's a lot of money," he said. "It is," she said. "It's also not what they'd get if they went to court, because what they'd get in court is less, possibly nothing, given the strength of the transaction documentation. But the cost of fighting them to get to nothing is not zero." "What would it cost to fight them?" She gave him a number. It was not small. It was the kind of number that, before the Munich sale, would have been prohibitive. Now it was painful, but possible. "What do you recommend?" he asked. "I recommend you think about what you want," she said. "Not what's legally optimal, what you actually want. The legal strategy follows from that." He thought about it. He thought about Evelyn Ashcroft standing at the window in Munich, saying, "I didn't ask the question," with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been sitting with a mistake. He thought about the number in the letter on his counter. He thought about 5 cars that had been heading for a hydraulic press on a Wednesday morning in April, that were now in the hands of collectors in 4 countries, that existed in the world as the things they were instead of as 3-foot cubes of compressed metal. "Counter," he said. "Half their number. One-time offer, 30 days to accept. No further negotiation." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "That's more generous than you need to be." "I know," he said. "Make it clear it's a settlement for legal peace, not an acknowledgement of any valid claim. That language needs to be precise." "It will be," she said. "And Nathan, this is your decision. If you want to fight it, I think you'd win." "I know," he said again. "But winning a fight and ending a fight aren't always the same thing." She drafted the counter that afternoon and sent it with language so precise that it would have taken a different and more expensive law firm than Mast's to find fault with the framing. 22 days later, Mast accepted. The settlement was signed on a Thursday morning, and Sandra called him to confirm. And Nathan said thank you and hung up and went to the workshop and stood in the empty space for a while, not doing anything, just standing in it. The legal matter was over. The financial result of the auction, minus Sandra's fees and the settlement and Patrice's loan with the interest she'd insisted on, was still enough to change the practical reality of Nathan Carter's life in ways that were significant, but that he was deliberately not thinking about too much yet, because thinking about it too much felt like getting ahead of himself, and getting ahead of himself was what had gotten other people into trouble. What he thought about instead was what came next. He called Evelyn Ashcroft. She picked up on the second ring, which suggested she'd had the number saved, which was interesting. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Nathan," he said. "We settled." "I know. Gregory told me this morning." A pause. "He told me the number you accepted. It was less than we asked." "It was what I wanted," he said. "More than that felt wrong." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't fully understand that," she said, "but I respect it." "You mentioned the Vermont property," he said. "Yes." The shift in her voice was slight but present, a quickening, something that might have been relief. "I haven't done anything with it yet. I was waiting." "For what?" "For this conversation, I think." Another pause. "I wasn't sure you'd call." "I said I would." "People say a lot of things after auctions," Evelyn said. "In my experience, the follow-through rate on emotional conversations at industry events is lower than you'd hope." He almost smiled. "I'm not particularly emotional," he said. "No," she said. "You're really not." It didn't sound like a criticism. "When can you go to Vermont?" They agreed on the second week of September, which gave Nathan 3 weeks to do what he'd told Patrice he needed to do, which was rest, and which he accomplished with partial success. He fixed the transit's brake. He cleaned the workshop properly for the first time since the winter, swept it out, organized the shelving, inventoried his supplies, and made a list of what needed restocking. He took Maya to the Science Museum, which she'd been asking about since June, and which he'd been postponing with the general excuse of being busy. They spent 4 hours there, moving at her pace, which was slow at the exhibits that interested her and faster at the ones that didn't. And he bought her a book about mechanical engineering in the gift shop that was probably 2 grade levels above where she was, and that she started reading in the car on the way home. He did something else in those 3 weeks that he hadn't done in a while, which was visit his father's grave. Not for any particular occasion, not the anniversary, not a birthday. Just because he'd been thinking about Raymond Carter in the specific way that the past few months had produced. The notebooks and the door hinge note and Maya's question about whether Grandpa would be excited, and it felt like a visit was overdue. He went on a weekday morning when the cemetery was quiet, which was his preference. He sat on the ground beside the headstone. He'd never found the right way to stand at a grave. Standing felt performative in a way that sitting didn't. And talked for a while, which was something he did less than he probably should, and more than he'd admit to most people. He talked about the Porsche, and about Maya's notebooks, and about the thing Franz had said at dinner in Munich about how Raymond Carter had been better than most people in the industry. He talked about the door hinge note and what it had felt like to find it, which was something he hadn't said out loud to anyone. He didn't expect answers, and he didn't get any, and that was fine. The visit wasn't about answers. It was about continuity. About the acknowledgement that the line between Raymond Carter and Nathan Carter and Maya Carter was real, was actual, ran through 12 black notebooks on a workshop shelf and 8 composition notebooks on a bedroom bookshelf, and the specific quality of attention that all 3 of them brought to things that most people walked past without looking. He went home and made lunch and picked Maya up from school, and that was the day. The Vermont property was a working farm that had been acquired by the previous company owner as part of a real estate portfolio that had nothing to do with cars, and the cars were an afterthought. A detached storage structure at the far edge of the property that had been built sometime in the 70s, and that smelled when Nathan pushed the door open on a gray September morning, like every storage building that had ever contained old things for too long. Dust and oil and the particular damp wood smell of a structure that had been sealed against weather with declining effectiveness over decades. Evelyn was there. She'd flown into Burlington the previous evening and was wearing something that was clearly not her usual professional wardrobe. Dark pants, a practical jacket, boots that looked like they'd been purchased for the occasion and broken in insufficiently, which Nathan noticed because she was slightly favoring her left foot and didn't seem fully aware of it. She had not brought Gregory Mast. She'd brought Lena, her assistant, who stayed near the door with a tablet, and what appeared to be the administrative confidence of someone who'd been in unexpected situations with her employer before. "How many?" Nathan asked, before they went in. "The inventory lists 11, Evelyn said, "but the previous owner's records aren't reliable. He kept notes in 2 different formats that don't cross-reference well. 11 cars, Nathan said. 11 vehicles. Some of them might be trucks. The inventory isn't specific." He turned on his flashlight and went in. The building was longer than it looked from outside, a consequence of the way the land sloped behind it, and it held more than 11 vehicles. He counted 14 on a first pass, some covered with tarps and some not, arranged with the informal logic of someone who had been adding to the collection over time without a consistent plan for organization. The uncovered ones were immediately less interesting. A mid-70s American pickup, a station wagon of similar vintage, 2 motorcycles that were not obviously old enough to be valuable, and not obviously recent enough to be useful. He passed them without stopping. The tarped ones were a different question. He moved through them systematically, which Evelyn watched from a position near the door that was close enough to see what he was doing and far enough to not crowd his process. She'd learned something from Munich, he thought. She'd come here to observe rather than to direct, to let the person with the knowledge do the thing that knowledge enabled. It was a different posture than the one that had authorized a disposal list without asking what was on it, and the difference was not small. The 3rd tarped vehicle made him stop. He stood in front of it for a moment, flashlight off. Just the shape under the tarp. The proportions. the specific height of the roofline relative to the length of the hood. "Nathan?" Evelyn said from the door. "Give me a minute," he said. He pulled the tarp. It was a Jensen Interceptor, a British Grand Tour from the late 1960s, dark green under decades of surface oxidation, with a fastback glass hatch and the kind of interior that had aged from luxurious to archaeological. Leather cracked and split, wood veneer delaminated, carpets that had been reduced to a ghostly suggestion of their original existence. The body showed rust in the lower sections, the kind that came from water pooling and sitting over years, but the upper sections were better than the lower ones suggested, and the structure, Nathan walked around it twice before touching it, reading the body lines the way you read a face for what it was actually saying underneath what it was showing, was sound. He crouched and ran his hand along the rocker panel, tapped at specific points. "What is it?" Evelyn asked. She had moved closer without him noticing. "Jensen Interceptor," he said. "Late 60s, British." He stood up. "It's not as rare as the Porsche. The Jensen isn't the kind of car that gets people out of their chairs at auction, but it's a significant car, well-regarded, genuine following, and if this is what I think it is in terms of specification and condition underneath the surface rust." He moved to the front and looked at the engine bay through the gap at the hood line. "It's a legitimate restoration project. Good legitimate or complicated legitimate?" "Both," he said. "Always both." He moved on. The fifth tarped vehicle was a Sunbeam Tiger, a small British roadster with an American V8 engine dropped into it, a combination that had made automotive journalists argue about it for 60 years, and that had a devoted collector following for reasons Nathan understood immediately when he pulled the tarp and saw the lines of the thing, compact and purposeful, sitting on dry, rotted tires that had long since given up their relationship with the road. The seventh was a Bristol 406, which was the kind of car that required explanation even in collector circles. Bristol Cars had built automobiles in small quantities for a small and extremely specific clientele, using an engine design of pre-war German origin that they'd obtained as part of post-war industrial reparations. And the result had been, for about 30 years, one of the most technically distinctive production cars in Britain. They were not famous. They were not in any mainstream automotive mythology. They were, to the people who knew them, remarkable. Nathan photographed the VIN plate and the engine bay and stood back. 9 of the 14 have potential, he said to Evelyn when he'd been through all of them. They were standing near the door in the September light, which was coming in at an angle that showed the dust in the air of the building like smoke. 3 are almost certainly significant enough to warrant serious restoration. 2 are borderline, worth doing if the condition is better than it looks from the outside. 4 are project cars that a competent restorer could do something with. The remaining 5 are... He paused. "I wouldn't send them to a scrapper without a second opinion, but I wouldn't invest heavily." Evelyn was listening with the specific quality of attention he'd noticed at the reception in Munich. Not the attention of someone waiting for a pause to speak, but the attention of someone actually processing. "And if you were me?" she said. "I'm not you," he said. "But if I were, I'd have the 3 significant ones independently authenticated before doing anything else. I'd document everything before a single thing is moved, and I wouldn't make a disposal decision on a Monday morning in between other meetings." She heard the edge in that and didn't flinch from it, which he respected. "No," she said, "I wouldn't do that again." The Jensen is the most immediately interesting. The Bristol is the most obscure, but potentially the most historically specific. If it's the right specification, there are buyers who'd cross an ocean for it. He looked back into the building. The Sunbeam Tiger is the most fun, if that's a relevant category. "Is it relevant?" "In this business, it sometimes is," he said. "Not everything has to be historically significant to be worth preserving. Some things are worth preserving because they're good, and people used to make them, and people don't anymore." Evelyn looked at the building for a moment. "Would you do it?" she said. "The restoration. If I asked." He'd been thinking about that question since Vermont had been mentioned. He'd been thinking about the empty workshop and the specific weight of not having something to move toward, and about the auction and the settlement and the quiet of the past 3 weeks, and about what his father had always said about the work itself. That the work was the point, that what the work produced was a consequence and not the reason. "Yes," he said. with conditions. What conditions? Every significant decision gets made with full information. You see documentation before anything moves. Nothing gets disposed of without an independent opinion. He looked at her. And you come see the work, not just the result, the process. She frowned slightly. Why? Because the problem wasn't that you authorized a disposal list. The problem was that you authorized it without understanding what was on it. The solution to that isn't better paperwork. It's developing enough knowledge to ask better questions. He said it without apology, because it was true, and she was the kind of person who seemed to respond better to truth than to tact, which was a quality he was beginning to actually appreciate. You can't learn what these cars are from a catalog. You have to see how the work gets done. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Behind her, Lena was making a note on the tablet, which was either excellent professional instinct or the specific habit of someone who had worked for Evelyn Ashcroft long enough to know that significant things happened quickly and needed to be written down. That's an unusual term, Evelyn said. It's an unusual situation, Nathan said. You hired me once without knowing what you were hiring me for, and it worked out. This time, you know what you're getting. I didn't hire you the first time, she said. You found the cars at a scrapyard. Semantics, he said. Something crossed her face that was the beginning of a smile, restrained before it fully arrived, which he was beginning to understand was how she expressed amusement in professional contexts. Fine, she said. Your conditions. They shook hands in the doorway of the Vermont storage building with the September light coming in at that low angle, and the dust still hanging in the air behind them, and 14 old vehicles behind them in various states of being discovered. And it was not a dramatic moment in any cinematic sense. No music, no meaningful pause. Just two people who had come at a situation from opposite directions and had somehow ended up in the same place. Lena noted the time on her tablet. He flew home the next morning and picked Maya up from school in the afternoon and told her about Vermont over dinner, which she received with the specific interested attention she gave to things that connected to the ongoing narrative she was assembling about her father's work and its place in a world she was gradually learning to read. How many cars? She said. 14 in the building, 9 worth looking at seriously. Another Porsche? No, he said. Different cars. A British Grand Tourer. A small roadster with an American engine. A Bristol. What's a Bristol? A very specific kind of British car built by a very specific kind of company for a very specific kind of person. He thought about how to explain it. It's the kind of car that exists because someone believed that doing a thing properly matters more than doing it cheaply, even if almost nobody notices. Maya chewed on this along with her dinner. That's like your work, she said. It's like a lot of things, he said. It's like your notes. Nobody needs you to keep notes in 7 notebooks about cars and how rooms look during auctions and what people do with their hands when they're trying not to be nervous. But you do it anyway because the doing of it matters. 8 notebooks now, she said. 8 notebooks, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Dad, she said. The lady, Evelyn. What about her? Does she actually want to learn, or does she just want to not make the same mistake again? He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, who was 8 years old going on something considerably older, who had been in a workshop and an auction room in a restaurant in Munich, and had paid attention to all of it and had written down what she noticed. That's a good question, he said. What's the difference? If you just don't want to make the mistake again, you hire someone to watch out for you, Maya said. But if you actually want to learn, you do the thing yourself. She picked up her fork. Which one is she? He thought about Evelyn Ashcroft standing in a Vermont storage building, watching him work through 14 old vehicles in September light, not crowding his process, paying attention with the quality of someone who was genuinely trying to understand and not just trying to supervise. He thought about her saying, I didn't ask the question in Munich with the exhaustion of someone who was tired of their own choices. He thought about the condition she'd accepted. You come see the work, which was not a condition a person accepted if they only wanted coverage against future mistakes. I think she's trying to become the second one, he said. Maya considered this. That's harder, she said. Most things worth doing are, he said. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her dinner. The Jensen Interceptor arrived at the workshop on a Monday morning in October, which was when Nathan had told the transport company to deliver it, and which was when it arrived, punctual and unannounced in the way that transport companies were when they were good at their jobs. Nathan was already there, had been there since 7, which was earlier than he'd intended, but later than he'd been getting up during the restoration, so it felt, relatively speaking, like sleeping in. He watched the car come off the transport ramp and into the workshop, and it looked worse in the Portland light than it had in the Vermont storage building, which was usually the way. Buildings with their own dim atmospheres were forgiving, and a bare workshop with good overhead fluorescence was not. The lower body rust was more extensive than his initial read had suggested. The interior was genuinely distressed in a way that would require decisions about what to save and what to replace, each decision requiring its own research into what period correct looked like for a Jensen Interceptor in the specification this car carried. He walked around it once with his coffee cup and his notebook, making no marks yet, just looking. His phone buzzed. Evelyn. Transport confirm receipt? He texted back. In the workshop. Looks worse in good light than it did in Vermont. 3 dots. Then, is that bad? He considered his answer. No. It means we can see what we're actually dealing with. Better than finding out later. A longer pause this time. Then, when do you start? He looked at the Jensen, the dark green under the oxidation. The lines of the thing, which were still there, still true, despite everything the years had done to the surfaces. The shape of something that had been built carefully by people who believed the work mattered, now sitting in a workshop in Portland, Oregon, with a man who believed the same thing standing in front of it with a coffee cup and a notebook, and the particular discipline of not rushing toward the thing you wanted to find before you understood what was actually there. Already started, he typed back. Documentation first. He put the phone away and opened the notebook to a clean page. He wrote the date at the top. Wrote the car's identification, Jensen Interceptor, approximate model year pending V1N verification, color, British Racing Green or near variant, condition as noted. He drew a quick sketch of the car from the front 3/4 angle, the way his father had always started documentation, not to capture the beauty of it, but to fix its proportions in his mind, to commit to paper the specific reality of what he was looking at before the work changed it. Then he set the notebook on the workbench, picked up his camera, and began. Outside, Portland was going through its usual October morning routine, the light coming in low and pale through the workshop's high windows, the neighborhood sounds assembling themselves into the ordinary music of a day beginning. Somewhere a block over, a dog was objecting to something. The Transit sat in the driveway with its cracked left mirror that Nathan kept meaning to replace and kept not replacing, because there was always something more urgent, and also because it had been cracked since a parking garage incident in 2019, and at this point felt more like a feature than a flaw. Evelyn Ashcroft had scheduled her first workshop visit for the 3rd week of October, which Nathan had noted in his calendar, and which he was going to hold her to. She had agreed to his condition because she'd recognized what it was. Not a professional requirement, but a human one. The difference between watching a thing happen and understanding why it happened. He couldn't make her curious. He could only make it possible for curiosity to be productive if she had it. Whether she had it was something the 3rd week of October would begin to answer. He suspected she did. He didn't know for certain, and he was comfortable not knowing for certain because certainty before evidence was the thing that had gotten Evelyn into trouble in the first place, and it was a mistake he tried to be vigilant against in himself. The only certainty he carried comfortably was the work itself. That was his father's lesson, and it was his own now, and it was, in its way, the simplest thing in the world. You looked at what was there, not what you hoped was there. You did the work that the thing required, not the work that was convenient. You kept notes. You passed the notes on. You took the time to answer a 7-year-old's questions thoroughly rather than efficiently, because efficient answers were for problems you wanted to get through, and real questions deserved better than that. He photographed the Jensen's front 3/4, then moved to the rear. Photographed the VIN plate, crouched and looked at the underside with his flashlight. Made notes, photographed the engine bay. Noted the condition of the wiring harness, which was not good, and the state of the cooling system, which was going to require significant work, and the specific character of the rust in the lower quarters, which was surface originated and not structurally compromised yet, which was the difference between a significant job and an impossible one. He came back up, looked at the car, and wrote, "Structure sound. Work required substantial. Timeline estimate, 4 to 6 months depending on parts availability for interior components. This is doable." He underlined "this is doable," which was not something his father had done in his notebooks, but which Nathan had adopted as his own practice. A reminder that the problem in front of him was solvable, written at the beginning when it was still hard to believe, so he'd have it on record when the middle of the work made everything feel intractable. He put the notebook down and picked up a flashlight and a dental pick, an old dentist's instrument that was one of the more useful tools in a restoration shop for probing suspicious body sections without causing damage, and went to the worst section of the lower driver's quarter to understand exactly what he was dealing with. The work began the way it always began. One small piece of information at a time, building toward the full picture that no single view could give you. The car resisted in the usual ways. Rust that was deeper in one spot than the probe suggested, a mounting point that was corroded in a way that would require fabrication to address, a section of floor under the driver's seat that had been poorly repaired at some point in the past by someone with access to filler compound and limited patience. Nathan worked through the morning without checking his phone. The coffee went cold on the workbench. At some point past noon, Maya would be in school learning something he didn't know yet and writing it in her notebook. At some point in the third week of October, a 30-year-old woman who had made an expensive mistake would walk through the rolling door and begin learning what questions to ask. At some point in the next 4 to 6 months, a dark green British Grand Tourer would leave this workshop in better condition than it had arrived in, would go to someone who would know what it was, would exist in the world as the thing it had been built to be. The work required patience. It required the discipline of looking before concluding. It required the willingness to start something whose outcome you couldn't guarantee and trust that the process itself was worth the commitment. His father had known this. Nathan knew it. His daughter was in the process of learning it, one composition notebook at a time. He probed another section of the quarter panel, found solid metal where he'd expected rust, wrote it down with something that wasn't quite relief but was adjacent to it, the small daily reprieve of finding that a thing was better than it could have been. He photographed the section, made a note. Outside, the October light shifted as clouds moved across it, and the workshop went briefly darker, and Nathan clicked on the work light above the car and kept going. There was always more to see, if you bothered to look. That was the whole lesson. That was all of it. You looked. You asked what it was. You did the work. Everything else followed from those three things, or didn't follow at all.